Hey everyone, welcome back. We are joined today by Tim Braithwaite. He is a great guest. I mean, a singer and an expert in solmisation, which we, as you know on the show, I am so obsessed with this new, but it's not new at all. For a lot of people who are introduced to music education and they're really introduced to fixed do and movable do, but when I discovered solmization, the more historical solmization. And when I mean historical, I'm not talking 100 or 200 years. I'm talking 800 years or 1,000 years. I'm talking really historical. I was so blown away by just the pedagogical insights, the compositional insights, the improvisational insights that can be gleaned from it. And so I just wanted to talk to anyone who had an interest, was an expert in it. And Tim is really, I think, one of these individuals. So Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. No, it's lovely to be here. Having seen quite a lot of your episodes, it's just lovely to be part of one of them.
Would you like to share a little bit about your background? I put some in the introduction of the show notes to promote the episode, but maybe you could just tell a little bit more, flesh out a little bit more about how you came to where you are now and a little bit of your training. I listened to an interview. You played the saxophone. That was not in.
Yeah, I forget about that every now and again. Actually, my bachelor's was probably more characterized by playing the saxophone pretty badly, but with great enthusiasm than it was singing, which is a bit strange to look back on it. But I suppose there is a link there somewhere, perhaps in the sort of passion and interest in improvisation.
Right.
No, so a little bit about me and my background, I suppose. I'm English, as perhaps you can hear. I grew up in the UK. I sang a little bit in the English choral tradition, but not in a big cathedral or anything, just a local parish choir. But I went when I was 18, as a lot of English singers do, to do a choral scholarship. I went to Truro Cathedral, the south of the country, which is a great place, really worth a visit. And what that
Where's that again? Wait, say that again. I want to bring that up on the map.
It's Truro Cathedral. It's in Cornwall, in the south of the UK.
Okay, I'll bring that. You just keep talking. I'll bring that up.
Okay. Yeah, it was wonderful. I had a fantastic year, but basically what it meant was I lived with, what was it? Let's say it this way: 2 altos, 2 tenors, 2 basses, and an organist. We all lived together in a grotty little house in Truro, about a minute's walk from the cathedral. And we sang a service every day, basically. So we sang a service Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then 2 on Sundays. And so this was a massive part of my early education.
Is it this Truro?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I can get some pictures here.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. It's really worth a visit.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's astoundingly beautiful.
Fantastic choir. I went back actually this Christmas for the first time in a long time to see one of the Christmas services, and it was just wonderful to be back there.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it was great. It was a real privilege to sing there every day. It was really, I mean, we just went through so much music. It was more than a crash course in musicianship training.
Right. Well, absolutely beautiful. Okay.
Yeah, worth a visit. And anyway, I went to university. I studied music at Royal Holloway, University of London. I was a choral scholar there as well, singing countertenor, by the way. And then after that, I came to the Netherlands. So I live now in the Netherlands. I came initially to study early music singing, so historical singing at the Conservatoire in The Hague. But I quite quickly changed. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about why, actually, as we continue on. I quite quickly changed. I took a year out and I basically gigged around as a freelancer for a little bit. And then I did a master's instead in historical music theory. It was actually quite a new course at the time. I don't even know if they run it anymore in The Hague. But it was great. I received just the highest quality of education. I was very fortunate that I was the only person on my course, so I just had utmost attention from it was wonderful. And then since then, well, COVID struck. And I've been singing a lot since then. I sing now mostly with Cappella Pratensis, which this group we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later. But I also gig around with other groups in the Netherlands, in Belgium as well. There we are on your screen. Um, and I teach at the Conservatoire in The Hague. I teach a class. It's sort of an overview history class for singers, basically looking at historical singing pedagogy and practice. We do a little bit of singing in the classes and a little bit of reading and lots of discussion, listen to a few recordings, that sort of thing. It's great fun. And I teach now, as of September, I've started teaching Renaissance counterpoint and analysis, as well as historical solmisation and reading from menstrual notation at the Conservatoire in Amsterdam, which is great fun, having a good time. So that's me, really.
Brilliant, brilliant. So, okay, there was probably a point in your story that kind of was a flame that kind of sent you on a journey. Can you actually speak about that moment?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different moments of inspiration or sometimes desperation, which sent me down different routes. I suppose the same as anyone, really, right? I remember perhaps a real starting point for me was I went on a choral summer camp called the Eton Choral Course when I was 16 or so. And it was my first time being surrounded by a lot of, at the time, younger people who were interested in singing. And it was my first time singing in a choir, really of quite a high level. So that was a real flame. It inspired me to move on. I suppose it inspired me a little bit to pursue singing further. Truro Cathedral really put me in a certain direction. That was great. Moving to the Netherlands, I have to admit, I moved. I tend to tell people I moved to the Netherlands because of its great reputation for early music, but the reality is I really moved to the Netherlands because of a girl. So that maybe is part of it. Um, you mentioned the sax. Of course, I played the sax at university. Actually, I played the saxophone quite a lot. Wow, it's all honesty coming out here. You have something about your face. Played the saxophone a lot at university because I was struggling with my singing quite a lot. And that's how I got into improvisation. So that's perhaps a strange link there. So lots of different things which have, of course, shaped me in the direction which I have gone over the past few years. So there we
Yeah,
are.
so I maybe you could explain did you have a pretty much standard music theory training? Because I always want to juxtapose this with what you're doing now, and it's very good because you could probably explain why what you're doing now is significant, or the things that you're doing that are significant because they are departures
Mhm.
from pretty much what everyone is doing now. And I know for me that the departure was very interesting and important for me. And so maybe you could explain. So what was your training like theory wise? Because you did a historical theory course. Was it all and I know pretty much jazz pedagogy is quite uniform apart from Barry Harris. It's quite
Mhm.
uniform around the world in terms of, Roman numerals, functions, modes, chord scales, and all of that. So what was your conventional training like?
So when it comes to jazz, let's not over egg the pudding here. I was really very bad. I I was fortunate enough to be on a campus where there was just enough jazz to be able to participate, but not enough jazz to actually have any competition. So we played basically 1 or 2 gigs a week in the college bar with little to no rehearsal for free drinks. That was my jazz experience for 3 years. So it was great. I had a wonderful time, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself to have a background in jazz theory. Um, and in fact, my background in theory, I suppose, is not typical in many ways either. I studied in the UK music, this sort of broad course, which allowed me to basically combine theory, performance, and musicology into one sort of hodgepodge of a syllabus, which was great. It allowed me to be a little bit of an all rounder. And then I really came at this whole world as a singer, which I think is quite unusual,
Hmm.
especially looking at some of my colleagues at various conservatoires that I've worked with. Most of them tend to be keyboard players. Yeah, absolutely. So I really have come at it as a singer. And then I, of course, went to do this early music theory master's. But in a way, I was also then, it wasn't a particularly traditional education then either, because I was sort of a guinea pig for a lot of the things that you have talked about on your show. So, for example, I have done very little Roman numeral analysis aside from the basic bachelor's education in it, which I received. I've done a lot of figured bass, unfigured bass at the keyboard. I've done a lot of improvised counterpoint. But the writing, the written counterpoint really came only in my master's, actually, and I struggled with it quite a lot at first. I was fortunate that I had a very, very progressive teacher and a very traditional teacher at the same time. Um, and I was really put through my paces during my master's there. And I work a lot. I have worked a lot at my written counterpoint because of that. Um, so it's not really a traditional
Mm.
theoretical education at all. Um, and I suppose in many ways, well, I would like to think that puts me in a position to be able to talk a little bit from experience of having been the guinea pig about how some of these techniques work. I was taught historical solmisation when I was studying singing at the Conservatoire in The Hague, which is a very fortunate position to be in and quite unusual. And I've taken it further with my own practice, of course, and through my own theoretical work. But yeah, it's been interesting to be a guinea pig in this world before I knew that that was something experimental and interesting. And then obviously as I grew as a musician and have read more and become more involved in this world, I've realized that what I went through was in many ways very special and very new, um, which I didn't at the time.
Yeah. Now, why the focus on? I mean, when we talk about people taking classical training, they're usually thinking about Mozart and Bach
Mhm.
and Beethoven, and then I guess there is a lot more interest in the Renaissance, but we're not even talking about the Renaissance. We're talking about earlier than the Renaissance, 15th century and earlier. So, how did you find yourself in those centuries, and what led you to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do actually do a lot of music. I work as a freelancer still. So in the Netherlands, that basically means I do a lot of Bach, uh,
Mm.
which is great, and I do enjoy it. But I think the thing that led me really to the 15th and 16th centuries in particular is yeah, like everything, a series of slightly weird events. I suppose to a certain extent, I was lucky to have been exposed to it growing up. My education as a chorister, I sang a little bit of mostly English 16th century music, and
Oh, okay.
right? And then in Truro and at Royal Holloway, where I studied as well, we sang a lot of Renaissance music there. And I came to the Netherlands thinking, sort of looking for something to do, wanting to experience, wanting to find a way to combine my experience in jazz with my work as a singer or with my life as a singer. And Renaissance music felt like an obvious choice because I had heard um, a little bit, and I really a very little bit about ornamentation at this point, and I'd heard a very little bit about improvised counterpoint at this point. And I thought, hey, what an interesting world to dive into. And I really was fortunate enough to find myself in a pretty thriving environment. I think that the culture in The Hague, especially for Renaissance music, um, is really something quite special. So I was very fortunate to find myself as part of it.
Okay, so we should jump in then. I think we let's just dive in because I think we everyone's excited now to talk about it. So let's just jump in. So here is perhaps the first slide of Johannes Tinctoris. Why don't you explain? You've brought together a lot of great materials here. So let's just jump in. Explain what he's saying here.
Sure. So I just selected this little passage. It's just a little bit of rhetorical ire, which I find just a little bit entertaining. The idea that there's no more dreadful insult with which to charge a musician than the claim that he doesn't know his hand. Of course, Tinctoris here is talking about his Guidonian hand, right?
Yep.
Um, and I just, it's not really, it's not, I suppose it's not the most interesting quote in the world. I just find it a little bit funny. And also as a nice way to lead into conversations about um, what is solmization, what is the Guidonian hand, what is the gamut, all of these questions which are essential to understanding Renaissance and medieval and also later music theory. So would you like me to go through a little bit of details about the
Yeah,
Guidonian
absolutely.
hand?
But Tinctoris, what century is he?
So Tinctoris is writing at the end of the 15th century. Yeah, that's a lovely little image.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
at the end of the 15th century, in the 1470s, if I remember correctly.
Is
Um,
he representative of any tradition that so when he says something like that, does he speak with great authority?
Tinctoris is authoritative, partly simply because his collection of works is really quite all-encompassing for a theorist of this period. So Tinctoris, in many ways, reflects the traditional career path of a musician during this period, in that he is a northern musician who went south, went to Italy, and his collection of theoretical material is it provides sort of an, let's say, an unparalleled understanding of late 15th century theoretical and musical style. So when he says something like there is no greater insult for a musician than not knowing his hand, of course there are people who disagree with this. There are people who and there are people who don't, of course, in this period. Who is it? There's this a theorist whose name I've forgotten, Gallicus, Johannes Gallicus, at the beginning of the nearer to the beginning of the 15th century, who rhetorically asks, if a singer were to lose his left hand, would to not have a left hand, would he not still be able to sing? And continues to go on a bit of a diatribe against the Guidonian system and the sort of intricacies of solmisation and that sort of thing. Even proposes a sort of alternate approach to mutation, which is interesting. But in many ways, Tinctoris is, of course, representative to a certain extent.
So everyone knew the hand from the year 1000 up to the 16th century. Would you say it was a very dominant sort of pedagogy?
So the hand, yes, broadly, the hand is a dominant sort of pedagogy, along with especially the system which it is used to represent. So the hand is basically a mnemonic tool through which you can represent and through which you can literally feel the structure of the gamut, the medieval musical scale. So the gamut is made up of several different parts, as you can see on the image which you've got on your screen. It's made up by the letter names and the syllables broadly, and there are other elements to it as well. And the syllables, as I'm sure you know, and as your listeners and viewers probably know, function in overlapping segments of 6 notes. And the hand provides you with this tactile experience, this tactile mnemonic aid for realizing, for memorizing, for understanding these tools. And there are different hands during this period. There are different approaches. There are different organizations of the hand, but the one that you have on your screen or had on your screen is a typical one, in that it starts here at the lowest note of the hand and goes round in a spiral up here and round like this, ending with the highest E, La, here on the back of the hand. You can see it's just nicely floating above the hand on your screen. So the hand, we find early images of hands from the 11th century onwards. It doesn't actually appear.
11th century.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I mean, for me, that's crazy. I mean, that is really significant. I mean, what a tradition. I mean, that's an ancient tradition.
Yeah.
And what were they doing before that? I mean, what about the years 800 and 900? They must have had something. I mean, oh my goodness.
Interestingly, I'm maybe going to just spiral around your question a tiny bit.
Yeah.
It's called the Guidonian hand, but it's only anecdotally really associated with Guido. It doesn't appear, for example, in any of his extant manuscripts.
What?
The whole right? But the whole point about
what's going on?
The whole point of the innovations, which Guido invented or borrowed and worked with, whatever, is to basically to speed up the training of a singer, because a singer before this, and this includes also notational innovations as well as solmisation, a singer, essentially the training of a singer would involve the memorization of this vast body of chant melodies. And so with these pedagogical tools, with the notation system, with solmisation, with the hand itself, there he is, look at him.
Looking like Plato there.
Yeah, pretty magnificent. With these, you essentially can reduce the amount of time it takes for singers to complete their training. You don't have to memorize the entire body of chant anymore, because reading it, you can learn to sing without a teacher, let's say. And of course, this goes in combination with tools such as the monochord as well, which provide sort of a pitch reference or a reference for various different intervals. But that's essentially the point of this early tradition, to allow singers to train quicker and to read music without a teacher.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just keep barreling on. So here we go. So
Great.
for
So this
Leo.
this next passage, yeah, this is jumping forwards just a few centuries. But this, I think, is a really nice passage because it's describing improvised counterpoint, chant sur le livre, really at the end of the 18th century. Um, and he's describing not just the practice, and actually it's a pretty extensive manuscript treatise with a whole load of examples at the back. Someday, somebody, maybe me, will make a transcription and a translation of it. It's a wonderful thing. But here in this passage, he's describing his mental process as he's improvising, as he's composing on the spot, as it's sometimes described. So, shall I just read it? It's a nice
Yeah,
little
yeah.
segment. Um, Maybe it's just worth saying that this is just this is in the context of him saying that this sort of chant sur le livre where everyone is improvising at the same time is a horrid sort of music. He says that it's such chaos. It sounds like sounds awful, and it's somehow a disgrace and an insult to God or something. He says at some point. So it's really quite a dramatic passage. But this is a really beautiful section where he describes the process of it. So I have just heard a fugue. I'm going to respond to it. I begin, and at the same time, I hear one of the other musicians who begins a series of dissonances, all above a cantus firmus. This is. I must abandon my fugue, my imitation, I suppose, and seek to accompany them. I myself want to make syncopated fourths on my plain chant. Will the musician who sings with me know how to adapt his singing to it? He will maintain his melody, I will maintain mine, the third musician another, a fourth, perhaps a fifth, a sixth, all according to different principles. So it's quite amazing, I think, because he's really describing the process of hearing someone else do something, changing, adapting, realizing that the other person hasn't adapted, realizing that you're surrounded by lots of people doing all these interesting things at the same time. And the result is, as he says in the next sentence, I promise, a bit of a mess. So I love this. I think it's a really fascinating passage.
This is 18th century, right?
This is 18th century, yeah. So I leapt forwards a few centuries in my collection of quotes.
Is this like contrapunto alla mente, but in the 18th century?
Yeah. So chant sur le livre, contrapunto alla mente, cantus super librum. This tradition basically survived, particularly in France and Flanders. Survived well into the 18th century. There are some early 19th century sources which talk about it, although mostly, as far as I found, they tend to talk about it in the past tense as something that happened in the author's youth and that sort of thing. But it's really quite a vibrant tradition during this period, and seems to have been pretty cacophonous at times as well.
Does it sound like Renaissance music, even in the 18th century?
So stylistically, it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Yeah, in many ways, it does actually sound quite a lot like Renaissance music. Um, there are some examples, as I mentioned at the end of Polio's treatise. There are lots of written out examples. There are some printed examples as well. But basically, it sounds a little bit like, maybe I'll get myself into trouble here, not very good, not very good prima pratica counterpoint exercises. I actually, if you want to draw up on your screen, I made
Yeah.
a edition of edition and translation of an earlier 18th century source on chant sur le livre by Marchand, and you can find it through Elam Rotem's wonderful early music sources. He has a section called Pi, please in English. And so I made this translation of this Marchand, and at the end of it is an example of what I mean, which one day I should record so that people can hear just how silly it is. So it's just a translation with a little bit of an introduction and a summary of some of the rules. Actually, much of the way of teaching is also quite historical as well. There we are. So yes, that what you just scrolled through was my introduction with a few notes and summarizing what's going on, and then this here you see is a side-by-side translation. If you go to the very end, I think the last few pages, there is an example. There we are. This Gaudeamus. So you can see a little bit what's going on here, and it really does look like stylistically pretty weird Renaissance counterpoint. So you have the imitation, this Gaudeamus. You have the imitation in the upper voice going on over a steadily moving lower voice, sung by either singers or played perhaps on a serpent, this wonderful instrument which is so heavily associated with French Baroque music, especially in French Baroque plain chant. And the singer, or as Polio tells us, and a few other sources tell us, the singers essentially create melodies on top of it. It's pretty
Wow.
fun. Yeah.
So this treatise will teach me how to do that.
It will, although when because I published it through Elam and his website, I think Elam said something like, "Thank goodness I didn't learn counterpoint like this," or something like that, and it is pretty horrible. Um, but it's a fascinating document, and it's really fascinating insight into these practices, which really are they feel, at least to me, with my I don't know, 21st century view of what 18th century music sounded like, it feels like it belongs a couple of hundred years earlier,
Mm.
which is
Mm.
really fascinating. Yeah, and so wow, you can flick through the translation if you want. There are a couple of really interesting manuscript sources, manuscript and printed sources from the 18th century, which talk about improvised counterpoint. But it was, by all accounts, pretty widespread, especially in France and Flanders. There are a few references to it in the Sistine Chapel, I think, if I remember correctly, is it what Mendelssohn's journey down to Rome? He documents some what seem to be improvised, extemporized polyphonic traditions. There's a little hint of it in the beginning of the 18th century as a sort of pedagogical exercise in England, from what I could find, but not a huge amount. And there's a really fascinating passage at the end of the 18th century, um, which suggests something similar about chorale harmonizations in Germany, which is interesting. Perhaps you could just pull up that link to the passage by Petri, the end of the 18th century, or 1770s,
Right here.
1760s. Yeah, fantastic. So this is a really interesting passage. It's not really the same tradition, but of course you can see there are a lot of parallels. It's basically talking about how to teach a congregation who wants to sing in harmony, um, who want to sing in harmony by ear, how to teach them to do so properly. And it involves, in true German tradition, teaching them via the process of figured bass, and writing their mistakes on a blackboard and that sort of thing. It's a pretty great passage. Yeah, there we are.
Now, something struck me, but you said, of course, the great Elam wrote him saying he wouldn't he would hate to learn counterpoint this way. I have in my mind that the ideal way is some sort of contrapunto all'mente, singing solfeggio, hexachordal solfeggio, because I'm of course biased, and that's what they did in Naples. So something like that, which is like you're in a church, you're singing lots of sacred music, you're singing improvised counterpoint. Uh, what would be a way that, because this French way that you just mentioned,
Mhm.
maybe it might be a little cacophonous, but maybe can you comment on, was that used to teach people how to learn music, or is that just the established way of singing?
So whether this source or not, this Marchand, which I translated, was used specifically as a textbook is difficult to say. If I remember correctly, in the preface, he says that it's actually to make the lives of teachers easier. So it's perhaps a way more of transmitting the rules. What I mean, and perhaps if I may, what Ella might have meant when I say it's not the nicest way to learn counterpoint, is perhaps that it clashes a little bit with some of our modern sensibilities. And actually, there's a nice passage in the early 19th century. Well, I can't remember who it's by. It's a series of reminiscences about church music in France in the 18th century, um, where the author describes how he was made in learning this to memorize all these, what seemed to him at the time, outdated and silly and old-fashioned rules, which is interesting. But I don't know, perhaps the logical extension to this is, what is the ideal way to learn counterpoint? And I think that there isn't a single ideal way to learn counterpoint. But I think that it's important, at least I think, for me, it's important to learn it as part of a tradition, as part of a sort of whole package. So, for example, I find that a lot of counterpoint teaching, of my counterpoint teaching, is talking about melodic idioms, which is great. It's, of course, part of understanding a musical style, but talking about melodic idioms is one thing, but it's a totally different thing if you're talking to somebody who has breathed a musical tradition for their entire life.
Mm, yeah.
So my ideal way of teaching counterpoint, be it through the methods of the Italian conservatoires, or of Marchand, of this 18th century French source, or if we're talking about the 16th century or the 15th century,
Mm.
wherever we are, is that it's part of a package deal. So I would hope that it comes with solmisation, a solmisation system which is appropriate or contemporary to the tradition of counterpoint you're trying to teach, a firm background in plain chant, a strong and consistent interaction with the repertoire or the style that you're trying to write in. And I think that those things are all a really important part of learning how to write counterpoint. And when I teach 16th century counterpoint, as of course I do, I try as much as possible to get my students to sing, to get my students to solmise, to expose them to repertoire, to expose them to the notation is of course a big one, to immerse them in the musical culture and tradition that we're trying to work with, as opposed to treating it as somehow an abstract exercise.
I'm gonna throw you a curveball. I just love this guy. This guy, William Byrd. I'm a I'm a huge fan of his. And so would he have known the Guidonian hand? Would he have known that?
That's a good question. Certainly in 15th century England, there are a lot of theoretical sources which talk about the Guidonian hand, no fewer or less than in the rest of Europe. In 16th century sources, if I remember correctly, it's much less common. And if I remember correctly, Thomas Morley, who is a major theoretical contemporary of William Byrd, he doesn't include the Guidonian hand. And in fact, his system of solmisation, which you'd find in other English sources towards the end of the 16th century, like William Bathe, etc., and beginning of the 17th century, Campion, etc., his system of solmisation is really quite different. And maybe this is a very intentional, very good link to the first of the videos that I sent you. This recording, this field recording by Alan Lomax. Because
let's do that.
Yeah.
Why don't you set it up while I bring it up?
Yeah. So basically, the tradition of solmisation in England at the end of the 16th century, let's say contemporaneous to Byrd and the beginning of the 17th century, which actually lasted in England at least well into the 19th century, and as you can see from this video, well into the 20th century. It's really quite an interesting system. Broadly, it's based on the Guidonian system, woot, re, mi, fa, sol, la, but instead, it recycles only 4 syllables, fa, sol, la, and mi. So instead of singing woot, re, mi, fa, sol, re, mi, fa, I might sing fa, sol, la, mi, fa, which is a totally different way of conceptualizing it. In a way, it's somehow more scalic. In fact, it's sometimes presented as a sort of 7-note system, woot, re, mi, fa, sol, la, fa, sol, with a flattened 7th note. Charles Butler, an early 17th century English theorist, spells this second fa P-H-A instead of F-A. So it's really a sort of different way of structuring the music, the different sort of, as they say, the scales of music, in order to have these 4 recycling syllables instead of the 6. And this video you're about to play is a field recording by an ethnomusicologist, an American ethnomusicologist called Alan Lomax. It's a really wonderful video from the 1980s, if I remember correctly. You probably have it there in front of you.
Yeah, 82.
1982. From a family in Alabama, and they're engaging in what's known as shape note singing or sacred harp singing. I don't know if you've come across this tradition at all.
I've heard the word sacred harp, yeah.
Right. It's basically Sacred Harp is a publication, a 19th century publication of hymns, which includes and is, forgive me if I get this wrong. It includes essentially an approach to notation where the syllables. First of all, it's based around this 4-note solmisation system, exactly the same as described by Morley. But the notes themselves are shaped in a way which reflects the properties of the syllables. So something like, if I remember correctly, every mi is a diamond-shaped note, for example, hence the phrase shape note singing. So it's really a tradition which is based around the solmisation system of Morley. It's exactly the same as Morley, as I said. And as you'll hear, they start off by solmising it on this 4-note, with this 4-note system, and then they sing the text.
Wow. So wait a second. So you're saying they're using the same principles as Thomas Morley?
Yeah. Fa, sol, la, fa, sol, la, mi, fa. just that.
So were they improvising?
No,
Uh,
they weren't. So it's a four-part notated hymn tune, basically. The
okay.
tune is in the tenor, which of course has great Renaissance precedent. Um, the beat which they're showing, you can see that it's this two-part tactus,
Yeah.
which is so typical of Renaissance and later sources on keeping time. There's this shared responsibility between the time beaters. I think that's a really lovely example of this. You have the sort of patriarch in the middle beating time, and then occasional people. There's one little kid tapping his foot with this two-part tactus. Yeah, and there's I guess it's his dad there or some. There's this guy in the white shirt showing the tactus as well. It's just such a really great demonstration of a lot of Renaissance theoretical principles in action. And of course, I'm not saying by any means that it's a direct continued tradition.
Yeah.
Traditions change and evolve over time, but it's really remarkable, I think. Really
That's
amazing.
quite lovely, honestly, to see multiple generations, children and all partaking, musicking, as they say, right?
Totally.
Participating. That's very lovely. I mean, that's quite heartwarming to see.
Yeah.
Now, should we tie it back into I guess, the sort of pedagogies that we were speaking about?
Yeah.
So, specifically with solmization. Okay, so I, I have to bring it back to my training. I did a little bit of movable dough. I explored fixed dough. Many of I can speak for maybe I can't speak for maybe classical musicians, but I know a lot of the jazz friends I had. They had abandoned all of this and started singing scale degree numbers. Essentially, I know one friend told me like he was good at ear training and he went through A's and everything, but then he said when I'm actually working as a working musician, I just use numbers. Quite honestly, what's interesting about all of this Renaissance and historical solmization is this actually is quite useful. Like you might actually use it for counterpoint, you might use it for composition, you might use it for learning plain chant. So can you speak a little bit about that six note solmization and maybe what's the case for learning it in terms of like, and never mind about maybe uses outside, just for maybe even just learning music, rudiments essentially.
Mhm. Sure. So I suppose to a certain extent it's tied up with ideas of whether solmization as a whole is a useful tool, and I personally think it is. But I know a lot of people don't. Actually, as part of the English choral tradition, I was thrown in at the deep end without any sort of system at all. It's sort of the musical equivalent of throwing you in a swimming pool and hoping you make it. Um, but I've since, after a brief period of resistance when I first started learning, so maybe it's worth mentioning
Mhm.
uh, that six note solmization is my native language. Let's say I never really worked seriously with a seven note system. I've
Mm.
only done six note solmization in my life, which is
That's a
amazing.
great control. That's it's rare to find that. That's good.
That's what I mean when I said earlier that I think I'm in a very interesting or lucky position, I suppose, in that I've had all of the things you talk about in your show, I've sort of been subjected to them by a series of quite experimental teachers. So I think that for me, first off, I find the Guidonian hand an extremely useful tool. I use it really very regularly in my own performing life, most obviously for improvising counterpoint. It's an extremely I don't know if a lot of people, when they were learning to sight sing, when I ask them about their experiences, say that they had some sort of tactile reference point. So for me, I grew up playing the violin as well. I used to imagine I was playing the violin, somehow feeling the fingers move on the different strings as I was sight singing. The Guidonian hand is now that for me. So it's a real sense of grounding when I read, especially if I'm singing something difficult or, heaven forbid, something I haven't prepared as well as I should have done in a performance. This really gives me a sense of stability um, and clarity, which is very helpful as a mnemonic tool. So that's really helpful. And solmization is a big part of that. It's really providing you with a clear sense on each clavis, each, let's say, point of the gamut, of what the function of each note is. Whether A, for example, whether this is a La, a Mi, or a Re. Right? So that I find is a really, really helpful use of this system. It provides me with a clear overview of the function of each note. So it's not just A, but it's A, La, La, Sol, Fa, Mi, or A, re mi fa sol la sol fa mi re, or mi fa la sol mi fa. It's all of these have different functions depending on their syllable, and I think that's a really invaluable purpose, an invaluable function of solmization, which I find, perhaps just because it's the only one I've been exposed to be particularly clear to me at least, with a 6-note system.
With okay, so you actually use it then in your professional life, which is, it's not
Yeah.
just a thing that you just learned and then you had to do as an undergraduate thing, and you you just kind of, it is an actual useful thing. That's very good for me to hear. And is it difficult to pick up? I mean, like, when you learned it, and what, and you have to learn because I think mutations is the thing that sort of scares people. Like, why bother with that? And why have the mutations? I mean, what's the point of all of that?
What's the point is a good question. There are a few kind of stereotyped answers, none of which I'm really convinced by. You could say that, for example, a system of overlapping 6 notes highlights very clearly a species of fourth and fifth within the division of the octave. So, for example, if I was to do something like C to C, I'll show you my hand because I'm doing it off the camera anyway. Ud, re, mi, fa, sol, re, mi, fa. If I was to do something like that, then ud, sol, re, mi, fa. I feel this relationship between a hex chord starting on C and a hex chord starting on G very clearly. So the octave very clearly is divided into a species of fifth and fourth. So maybe that's part of it. Certainly, you find this referenced a lot in earlier sources on, for example, modal organization of chant. So that's, I think, part of it. Also, a big element of this is, and I think this is quite important to understand, is that the medieval gamut is not strictly diatonic.
Yeah,
It's
what's up with that? What's
not
the
strictly
deal there?
scale. So because it has both the B flat and the B natural as part of its musica recta, as part of its core structure, it needs a system which can navigate both of these things well, which means that because you can't really mutate between B flat and B natural without engaging in what's known as permutation, which is a little bit less than ideal, you need a system which allows you to traverse this system in a way which isn't strictly scalic. It's not strictly a scale. And therefore, this overlapping sort of modular system, which allows you to therefore sing the same notes with different meanings, really maps onto that extremely well. And in fact, it's a yeah. Does that help answer your question at all?
Keep going. I like it.
I sort of forgot where you started, so it's just difficult to keep
Well,
going.
just the point of the mutations, is it going to help you? Is it going to help you with really looking at a piece of music, and rather than just seeing it as a 7-note key? You
Mhm.
said that really they thought not so much in that way, right? They thought, is it modally or something like that?
Yeah. So
Or
when I
or
said
you're talking about musica recta?
modally, sorry, I was talking about the modal system as a way of organizing um, melody, let's say, because
Yep.
the modal system is a way of organizing melody. And there are overlaps between the modal system and the solmization systems, such as this emphasizing of different species of fifth and fourth. So C to C is a different species of octave. It's made up of different species of fifths and fourths than D to D or E to E. And this is emphasized quite nicely in a system which overlaps basically at the fourth and the fifth. So if I have my natural hex chord here starting on C, can either then continue on F with a soft hexachord, or G with the hard. So the fifth and the fourth here are quite clearly emphasized in a way which fits, especially from my experience, the structures of Renaissance music pretty well. Um,
Okay.
Apart from this, there may be more obvious things, especially in the 16th century, when you start to find examples of inganno in compositional techniques, where you continue the same subject, but using the same syllables, but in a different hexachord.
Right.
There are, of course, instances like you can see very clearly that there's really a culture of solmization around, particularly Renaissance, late medieval and Renaissance musicians. So you can really internalize the sort of games that are being played. The classic example is this soggetto cavato, Hercules dux Ferrarie, where all of the syllables of this guy's name are taken and converted into solmisation syllables by Josquin. So you have Hercules dux Ferrarie, which is re, fa, mi, re. Aside from this, composers clearly very obviously very regularly write their names using solmisation syllables. Have you seen any of these examples?
No, no.
Oh, it's so stupid. Tell you what, I can send you a little nice example now. Okay, so this little example you have on your screen, this Pater Jacobus, Father Jacob in Dutch. It's Frère Jacques. It's his
Yeah.
famous. I wrote this for a workshop we did with some kids in the Netherlands. As you can see, we have in the upper voice the cantus firmus to be sung by the kids. Vader Jacob, slaapt gij nog, etc. There was a second part as well. And then we all sang Cappella Pratensis. We all sang the other voices. But if you zoom in on my signature, of course, I wrote it. I used Elam's wonderful Serenissima program to write in menstrual notation here. If you look at this ridiculously bad joke in the top right-hand corner, my historically informed humor. Right? So what's going on here? Can you tell me a little bit about this joke?
Bray.
Yeah, right? So Ray. This is Ray in the soft hexachord, hence the B flat. And you find this all the time, this awful sense of humor in 15th and 16th century composers' ways of saying their names. So du fai, for example, fa-i with the fa sign. Alamire is a classic example. There are other examples which are pipelare. You have lare. Other examples. So it's clearly a strong culture of solmisation surrounding the music at this time.
Now they don't seem to be having a good time.
Yeah, this is a great image. This is from the altar piece. It's just stunning, right? It's these singing angels. You can see they're all singing around the single book. This is the element of singing from a choir book. And I've heard lots of theories regarding this image. So I've heard some people suggest that you can tell what voices they're singing from their facial expressions.
Right, like this could be the bass, right?
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. I find that a little bit hard to get behind, but fine. I've also heard it suggested that maybe these 8 here represent the 8 church modes. Are there 8 of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. So that the different characteristics of the 8 church modes. I just included it because it's a wonderful image. You have all of this incredible interest going on, all this detail. You have, apart from the funny faces, which is of course the most obvious, the choir book. This beautiful little scrap of paper sticking out of the top of the choir book. You can see clearly the guy beating time. This is very widely documented. Beating time, quite possibly hitting the choir book. There are references to both audible and inaudible ways of beating time during this period. It's just amazing. And I think actually maybe if you don't mind, since we talked a little bit about using solmisation in the hand in my professional life, maybe it'd be nice to now talk a little bit about mensural notation as a way of performing this music.
Absolutely.
And I sent you a little video of us performing with Cappella Pratensis some Mouton, Jean Mouton, who's and it's a piece, Nesciens Mater, which is this amazing canon. I also sent you, as part of the collection of sources, a facsimile of a manuscript version of it, which is kept in the archives in Den Bosch, which is our hometown of Cappella Pratensis. This is the source that we're singing from. We're singing directly from a facsimile reproduction of this. And if you go to the video as well, I don't know if it's possible to have both up, you can see that we're all singing from the same book. So this is actually a live recording from a performance in New York last year, I think it was, of this piece. And maybe I could just say a little bit about what's going on here, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So this piece, Nesciens Mater by Mouton, it's a fantastic piece. It's actually, each voice here is working in canon at the fifth. So you see at the very top of each voice part, or at the top of the page, and then on the left-hand side, it says fuga in diapente. So you can follow along perhaps most easily. You hear the the first voice enter here on this F on the top left-hand corner. And then when you get to that little funny squiggle, just a few breathes later, that's a signum congruentiae, and it's an indication for the next voice to imitate this upper fifth. And all four voices are doing this at the same time. So it's actually an 8-part piece notated here in 4 voices.
Oh, that's divine. Wow. Wow. I need a minute.
I think we have a few more minutes. It's fine. Wasn't your last interview 4 hours? We've got a bit left to go.
Wow. Tim, that was great. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's really nice to watch this
Amazing.
back. This was actually at the very last piece of the very last tour of a very last concert, sorry, of a very demanding tour. We were all exhausted. One of our singers was having a migraine attack as he's singing, so it was pretty. But it's amazing. I don't know. I really feel when I listen to it somehow the exhilaration of us all coming together for this great tour, and the fact that we got through it.
No, it's gorgeous, and I mean, I'm kind of lost for words here. We were talking about what, solmisation or something, but that just knocked me off me. I kind of lost my train of thought there. So.
Well, I'm pleased you like it. But the point is, so first of all, I don't know. You can see a lot of the faces from the Ghent altarpiece.
Yeah, it's like the painting, isn't it?
It's exactly like the painting. But also,
yeah, it's just
we all.
yeah. I mean,
sorry, go on.
No. I was just saying, yeah. It was exactly like the painting. I mean, they, almost in the same sort of way where, like, where is it? See, I mean, oh, now it's too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, life imitates art, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
But sorry, I interrupted you. You were talking about the tour.
No. I mean, it's just nice to hear the recording because it's quite a memorable concert and a memorable last piece of the concert. But I chose this example for a few reasons. Partly because of the hilarious variety in facial expressions. Partly because in the group we all have varying degrees of comfort with Cornell in the corner, like wailing on the high note. Anyway, various different degrees of comfort with solmisation. I use solmisation pretty regularly in performance. I know a few of them do as well. But really because it's the interaction with the manuscript that is, I think, what's really interesting that's going on here. And this example is so interesting because in the manuscript you get something really tangible that is different from singing from a transcription, from a modern transcription, which is this element of the game, the element of the puzzle, that it's a canon. You are reading one part and you're singing another. So I'm actually reading the same, I sing the highest voice here. I'm reading the same part that one of the high tenors is singing, just a fifth higher and a couple of beats later. And the experience of doing this, as well as, of course, all singing from a single book with this singular element of focus, it's really magical.
Wait, I'm confused. Okay, so I people think that I do all these interviews and I get it right away, but I'm still learning. So, like, hold on a second, everyone. So it's not like where you have a choral score today, everyone has their parts and you read it and it's there. Is there some element here of decoding the manuscript? Okay, so can you just walk me through that? So what we saw this, right? Let me bring up the okay. So let me go to the two pagers here. So
sure. Well, maybe you can focus, if you focus on that top left-hand corner.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you. I'll tell you. I'll walk. Sorry. I'll walk you through the whole manuscript, and then we can look specifically at this top left-hand corner.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Sorry. So what we have here in a typical choir book format, we have the 4 voices laid out basically in separate parts in each corner of it. We have the top left here. We have the superius, the highest voice. Then below we have the tenor. You can see it's written.
Right.
See the word tenor there. Then we have top right. We have contra.
Yep.
And then the bottom right we have bass.
Okay.
Yeah. What's special about this piece? So already that's very different from a modern score, right? So what's different about this piece, aside from the fact that you have this layout, of course, which is typical of the time, is that each of these parts is in canon. So if you now zoom in on the top left, I'll just give you a small example of what I mean by that. Sorry.
Let's preview. Okay. Here we go.
So here we have, this is my part, this is the part I'm singing. And it starts off with one of the high tenors of the group singing this opening line. So he sings F, 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 E, D, C, B flat, C. Reading your C clef here, alto clef, no problem. And then you see it says here, fuga in diapente.
Yep.
This means
At the
it's a
fifth.
canon at the upper fifth. And that little 3 dots below, this means that at that point, the next voice, the comes, the follower, comes in. So once my colleague has sung this opening phrase, I do the same thing, but instead I sing C, 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 B flat, A, G, F, G.
And you have to count in your head where that C is, right? And then you have to
I
jump
count
in.
in my head, but if I'm telling the truth, I pretty automatically switch to soprano clef at that point, and I feel it very clearly on my hand as well.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So
So you
this
have those aids to do that.
exactly, it's something to hold on to. So in my head, it's soprano clef, and on my hand, it's just reading it the same. So it's not any more difficult, really, than reading a normal choir book in menstrual notation. But you have this element of a puzzle to it. Now, we're fortunate here in this example, the words fuga in diapente give the game away a little bit, but there are plenty of puzzle canons from this period
Yeah.
where that's not obvious. You have to try and work out what the canon is. Often
Wait, there's
accompanied
a
by little
whole
riddles in Latin, for
there's a
example.
whole bunch of you singing. So,
Yeah.
but there's 4 parts here. So who is singing what then? So
So
there's a bunch of tenors, a bunch of basses, a bunch of contra. Was that what's happening?
basically, yeah. So you have, again, if we look at the top left as an example, you have a high tenor is singing that, and a fifth higher, a high countertenor, a high falsettist.
Okay.
The same with the tenor. You have probably looking at the ranges, it's the equivalent of a baritone,
Okay.
modern equivalent of a baritone singing that, and then a fifth higher, a high tenor singing that. The contra, so this is the top right hand corner. It's sung as written by a high tenor, and it's sung in canon a fifth higher, sorry, and a few beats later by another high countertenor, another high falsettist.
Okay.
And then the bass is sung by a low bass, and then a few beats later and a fifth higher by a baritone. So we're all
So it's like
performing this.
two people per part, sort of. Something
Yes,
like.
if I remember correctly in the video, some of us might be doubling because this was our encore. We all came together and did it as a grand finale. But basically, there are 8 parts going on here, and we're reading it from 4 parts. So it's a really remarkable example. It's direct theoretical
That's
engagement.
complicated.
Of course. Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing piece, and it's an amazing experience to sing it. But it's direct theoretical engagement with the source of the sort which really like forces me to imagine clefs, to use my Gudonian hand, to use my solmisation um, in performance. I think that's a really, really cool thing. I feel pretty privileged to be able to do that.
That is awesome, man. And the end product was divine. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Yeah,
It's still reverberating. So I mean, fantastic. All right, so we let's keep going now.
yeah.
So what is this?
So we said we might talk a little bit about historical composition and the way that counterpoint worked in practice in the 16th and 15th centuries. So I chose this example. This is from Ornithoparchus's treatise. And it's a really interesting comment because it says something quite remarkable about compositional practice from this period. If you don't mind, I'll just read this out loud.
Yeah.
It will be necessary for the beginners of this art to form a 10-line scale. Now, sorry to interrupt already. Perhaps you better go to the next slide to show you what that means. So a 10-line scale here, this is from the same treatise, is functioning in much the way that you might expect a modern score to function. You have like a little grid, let's say, with each brevis, each breve, barred off in a way that it's organized. It looks in a way like a modern score. You have the clefs up on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
You have here the gamma ut at the bottom, F clef, C clef, G clef, and then it's showing you the D above that as well. But it's essentially functioning as a way of organizing it visually on a page. So that's what he means when he says 10-line stave. We can go back now, perhaps.
Okay.
Separated by bar lines. So here we are. So this is for beginners, so that they can write each breve within each bar, properly marked with clefs, so as not to be hindered by a confused mixture of notes. However, it's better to compose without a 10-line scale, without this sort of score. But because it's difficult, let the young people begin with a 10-line scale, with this sort of score. So the
Like
point of this
this
is
thing.
that
Yeah.
he's saying what I think we might all agree with, that it's pretty much easier to perform when to compose when writing in score format than when not. And he's saying this because the evidence really points to the fact that the vast majority of written composition during this period was written not in score format. And that's why he's saying it's for beginners to do this. Bermudo, who's writing a couple of decades later, even says that writing in score is simply for people who don't know counterpoint. And the point is that if you don't write in score, you have to be able to count very carefully. And if you're not writing in score, it's very easy to lose count. So I think this points to one of the most remarkable, at least from our perspective, remarkable facts of Renaissance and medieval compositional practice, that these people were writing counterpoint without any direct vertical alignment, at least in a lot of the examples we have. And of course, there are some exceptions.
Wow.
You couldn't possibly say that every composer from the 17th or 18th century composed in the same way. There's variety in this period as well. But the vast majority of theoretical sources and also surviving manuscript sources suggest that an actual score wasn't used by the most advanced composers. There's a great study by Jessie Ann Owens called Composers at Work. It's quite old by now, I think, but I still recommend it as a reference work for my students on historical compositional practice, which really goes into great details about this. And she basically comes up with the conclusion that the majority of that it was common to write in what she calls quasi score, so where the voices are on top of each other but not aligned, so you can follow along quite easily as you go if you're comfortable with menstrual notation. But that actually writing in score was not common during this period. In fact, it seems to have become more common throughout the 16th century. Calvisius, for example, at the end of the 16th century, there we are, that's the one. For an easy $55, is that great? Calvisius, at the end of the 16th century, for example, says that older musicians of the previous generation, used to compose in 5 lines, so the independent lines. However, modern composers will write in a score. But it seems really that this is quite clear from the 15th and 16th centuries, that the majority of composers were writing without a score in front of them, which is pretty wild.
What do they do then? So wait, hold on. If they don't do that, what do they do? Like,
what do they do? Good question. So perhaps I'm not very good at answering your questions. I'm going to go take another detour.
No, this is great. People like this.
One thing I find really interesting is what they didn't do. And I say this because I approach this music really as a singer, and although I do have some keyboard skills, it's not my way of thinking. I think, as I sort of said, now with the hand and with solmisation, etc. But there is a fascinating quote by Hermann Fink, who's a theorist in the middle of the century, who criticizes composers. And he says, actually, in fairness, that a lot of composers are doing this, but they shouldn't. He criticizes composers for composing at the keyboard. He says that some composers nowadays are learning how to. Oh yeah, I included it. There we are. They tinker with a clavichord for a long time until, with whatever habit they have acquired, they learn to notice a certain harmony by the touch of the keys and the articulation of the fingers, and learn to transfer it to paper from there. And so at last they produce a composition full of pauses and mistakes without regard to the mode. And there are, as I said, a great number of composers of this kind today. Now,
I really like the full stop, and there are a great number of composers. I almost I can draw out the dryness just from that line.
The passive aggressive text speak full stop, exactly. Yeah. I find this fascinating because this, for me at least, flies directly in the face of what you expect from a 17th, 18th century source on composition, and from my experience as well. When I was writing fugue or realizing partimenti, actually a big part of the battle was trying to get the muscle memory of the chord shapes really into my fingers. And I think that's a very reasonable pedagogical approach, and I think it's a very successful pedagogical approach. I also play the lute, and I can really feel the chord shapes, the shapes when I'm playing.
Mm.
But what's fascinating about this is that he says, no, that's not the way to do it. And that will, in fact, cause bad counterpoint. Now, I'm sure that's not always the case.
Didn't Bach talk about harpsichord knights or something who just I know there's a quote that he was like saying that people compose with their fingers or something. So I think there's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
anyway, sorry, you were saying.
No, that's good. And so what actually the majority of sources that I've come across seem to suggest is that you do is essentially you write one line and then you write another line against it. Dramatic, I know. And so Vicentino, who's writing a little bit earlier in the century than Fink, if I remember correctly, he has some interesting comments on checking music, that the way to check, because if you're not writing in score, it's difficult, of course, to align all the parts. The way to check it is to follow each line in tandem. So you follow each line individually. You do the soprano against the alto, then you read the soprano against the tenor, then you read the soprano against the bass, then you read the alto against the tenor, then the alto against the bass, then the tenor against the bass. So it's essentially checking a series of duets in order to see how it works. Because, of course, contrapuntal pedagogy, through the lens of both writing and chant sur le livre, improvised counterpoint, is essentially a two-part activity. It's the process of adding a single voice or many single voices to something that's pre-existing, right? And so I think that's a really revealing comment, which gives a little bit of insight into how this works. And I like the idea of counting in particular for several different reasons. So we know that composers relied a lot on simply counting breathes, collections of, let's say, structural, let's say like the equivalent of bars, perfections. They relied on counting breathes to do this because we have a series of letters between these two theorists, Spataro and Aaron, and they are exchanging all sorts of interesting theoretical ideas. But in one of them, a mistake is pointed out in a composition by Spataro, if I remember correctly. And Spataro says something like, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake because I wrote the number 9 for 9 breathes after this passage, but I meant to write the number 8. So he's miscounted. And so I think that's a really fascinating point, that they seem to have worked in these little blocks. They create phrases of, well, in this case, 8 or 9 breathes, and then they join them together. So it's this additive process, which is fascinating, I think.
Now, why don't just have them all in a score and then you can just see it, right?
I actually not sure I could fully answer that without making it up as I go along. I also find it quite interesting that it's not that Ornithoparchus, for example, is unaware of the existence of scores, or in this case, the 10-line stave. And in fact, scores you do find throughout the 16th century, really, in various different formats, mostly for study purposes by the sound of things. But that for some reason, and this I'm not sure I can tell you why, for some reason it's associated with being a beginner. And there are a few other sources which really say explicitly this. Cochleus says the same. Dressler says the same. That, as I said, Bermudo says exactly the same. That you can write in a score if you're a beginner, but if you're a master, you don't need to. So why would you? And I don't really have a clear answer for that. I could guess that it's maybe something to do with melodic as opposed to vertical thinking. But I'm not sure I can give you a clear answer.
Did they so they okay, so I was going to ask you about something, but let me just quickly ask about just this idea of 5 chords and 6 chords that we use in the 18th century. Were they really thinking more intervallically, or were there certain conventions of chords that were cropping? Because I know there's the Baroque guitar back then, or the Renaissance lute, and I'm sure there was some kind of strumming going on. So, or maybe I don't know. How does that all factor into just, I guess, vertical units of harmony, or did they even conceive of that, or not at all?
So, I mean, you're totally right. There is, of course, a huge vertical aspect to this. There's a bit of a cliche that Renaissance music and Renaissance counterpoint is entirely horizontal, and of course, that's not true. Any counterpoint treatise will start by telling you the species of interval, which is already thinking vertically. And throughout the 16th century in particular, there seems to be a greater focus in various different circles on, let's say, different types of chord or chord shape. So we could point to Zarlino, for example, as to a certain extent laying the groundwork laying the fundament, if you'll excuse the bad pun,
Mm.
for this sort of ways of thinking. Of course, the first clear reference to the triad that we have is who is it? A German theorist at the beginning of the 17th century, whose name has for some reason escaped me. It doesn't matter. But you do find some interesting things. For example, Pietro Aaron includes a really nice consonance table, which sort of says if the alto is doing this above the tenor, and if the soprano is doing this, then the bass does this. It doesn't really have much. It's pretty exhaustive, and so it doesn't really tell us much about spacing. Perhaps a clearer example of that might be a passage in a keyboard treatise by Tomás de Santamaría, who describes a technique of playing in consonances, if I remember correctly, that's what he calls it, which essentially are a series of idealized chord positions, which, if used correctly, allow you to generate basically mechanically a series of contrapuntally correct progressions. And so this is really quite clearly, from a keyboard's perspective, thinking vertically. Going a little bit later, you mentioned strumming along. Alphabeto notation is a good example of this, which is a sort of a notation for plucked instruments, which is in some ways comparable to chord symbols. It shows you basically what we might say, which chord to play. So there are a lot of hints that this sort of triadic thinking is becoming increasingly strong in the 16th century, but theoretically it doesn't really take a foothold until the 17th century. For example, a lot of sources are still calculating intervals from the tenor as opposed to from the bass, which is interesting.
Why the tenor? Why is the tenor the holding voice rather than the bass?
I suppose it depends. It's a little bit like everything in Renaissance and medieval music theory, a little bit convention. So if you go back through your many centuries, then you find that the tenor is typically the lowest voice. Let's just say, for example, looking at Parisian organum, the tenor is simply the voice which you could say which holds the chant, but perhaps more accurately supports the structure of the composition or the improvisation. And this is called the tenor, from tenere, the Latin to hold, but it's the lowest voice. And then as you find that with this comes the development of the contratenor, the voice which moves against the tenor, which can be either above or below, or indeed working both above and below. And at the end of the 15th century in particular, you start to find really a concrete, a sort of convention of a voice below a contratenor bassus and a contratenor altus. And therefore, sort of through this process of evolution, you find the tenor being, in a way, this middle voice with a contratenor bassus, a bass below it, and a contratenor altus, an alto above it, and of course the superius or cantus or discantus above that as well. And with this sort of, I suppose, evolutionary way of thinking, and that's always a little bit dangerous, but hopefully you'll forgive me, you can see how that intervals calculated from the tenor, this tradition sort of remains. And so one example I find really interesting, again, from Ornithoparchus, he talks about, and he's not the only theorist to do so, but I remember Ornithoparchus particularly, he talks about a cadence on E. So the tenor does its tenorizans, its step down F to E. The soprano, the superius, does its cantizans D to E. And this is a structural cadential pairing. However, he adds to this, not as an afterthought so much, but as an addition to this structural cadential pairing. And the lowest voice, of course, it can't do B to E, because then it has this tritone with the F, B to F. The lowest voice goes D to A. But this is still essentially a description of the cadence on E, even though the lowest voice is moving D to A. So does that make sense a little bit? So it's just this different way of thinking, that in those instances, the voices are calculated from the tenor. But as I say, this does change a lot during the 16th century. Morley is a great example at the end of the century, because he's a little bit topsy-turvy with it. He talks about calculating consonances from the tenor, but then also continues to calculate consonances from the bass later on in the treatise. But it's you're right. It feels somewhat counterintuitive for us. There's Morley.
So you said that the tenor was the lowest voice, but so they didn't have basses back then?
Uh, Good question. So pitch and voice range is a bit of a complicated issue. You're right. We very clearly associate today words like tenor or, well, tenor is a good
Mm,
example as any,
yeah.
tenor with a specific way of singing, a specific set of frequencies which the human voice is producing. Um, but it's not quite as clear cut as that, especially historic, let's say 14th century and earlier. Tenor in particular has this function of it has this role as a sort of compositional contrapuntal function, as opposed to necessarily being associated with a specific sort of voice. However, as ensembles and compositional styles become increasingly standardized, these voices essentially become more and more connected with certain, these compositional voices become more and more connected with um, vocal, with voices, with the human voice. So you can find, for example, references to people being sent north, typically Italians being sent north um, to find specifically high altos, high countertenors, or low basses, and that sort of thing. But the question of pitch itself is a bit of a tricky one. So, in its broadest sense, pitch is quite flexible. Um, a lot of sources say quite clearly that the pitch is set according to the range of the singer, according to the range of the person giving the intonation, for example, in plain chant, etc. Um, and that therefore plagal modes, for example, which tend to descend, should be sung a little higher, and authentic modes, which tend to ascend, should be sung a little lower. But this gets a little bit more complicated when we consider the sort of increasingly standardized voicings of the contrapuntal idiom of this time, which means that certain modes, or it's a difficult way of saying it, what's a better way of saying it? That these voice types, although the pitch is essentially determined by the singers, certain conventions arise regarding pitch and, let's say, transposition. And this is, of course, codified and classified in the 16th century through the technique, through the practice of chiavetti, or high clefs, basically the conventions in which certain clefs are transposed down either a fifth or a fourth, depending on which, or certain combinations of clefs, sorry. But broadly, therefore, certain voice types become quite heavily clearly associated with certain voices, compositional voices. However, even in the 16th century, this isn't set by any means. We have lots of references, for example, of practices in convents where voices were transposed. Sometimes only a few voices were transposed. Sometimes the whole thing was transposed upwards. You have therefore nuns singing bass. Sometimes even, in fact, we have reference to nuns with very low voices singing the bass part, but also things being transposed up so that the bass part is sung then in the middle of the texture, which is really interesting, can create some...
Really? Okay.
What's the name of the theorist who talks about that explicitly? There's a great article by Laurie Strass, who's a musicologist, who's done a lot of work around performance practices of nuns in the later 16th century. And she cites a theorist whose name is Vecchi, Orazio Vecchi, at the beginning of the 17th century, who describes a series of transpositions, including some which involve, if this is our four-part texture, something like this. So then you have lower voices becoming middle voices, etc. It's pretty wild. I can't remember
They
all the
would
details.
they take established compositions and do that
It
with
seems that way, creating what you could call voci pari settings, equal voice settings, out of voce piena settings. And also the other way around. So you have
yeah.
references of full voce piena is full voice. So let's say SATB.
Mm.
You also have the opposite. So I think it's Pietro Aaron off the top of my head, although I might be wrong on that. Describes how you can create a voce pari setting of equal voices by transposing the upper voice down an octave and having it sung by a tenor, which of course seems far more logical, perhaps, in our mind.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a tricky one. Pitch, transposition, and voice ranges and voice types in this period is complicated. There's an added possible difficulty. Well, perhaps that's for another day. It's a tricky one.
Okay, what's this?
Great. So yeah, this is a slate from, I think it's from Wells. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a bad quality image. It's a screenshot of a photocopy, if I remember correctly. But you can see its preliminary musical exercises being written on it. It's really remarkable. It looks like it's 15th century. I think one of the next slides is a passage by Coquelicot. Maybe it's the one before that, perhaps?
Oh, let me zoom out.
Maybe the one before that.
Biancheri.
Oh, yeah, great. So this is a passage by Coquelicot, which talks a little bit about the relationship between writing and improvising. And he talks about slates specifically, which is why I provided that little image. So he says the following. Having learned these species of intervals, so the consonances and dissonances, etc., and the method, here is how we ought to use them. The boy should provide himself with a slate, as you saw, on which one may easily write and erase. He should take a tenor from plain chant and begin to write note against note counterpoint, through the intervals. When he's gotten used to making note against note by improvisation, extempore, so presumably there's sort of a step missed in this description, and has become practiced in it, he can then go on to florid counterpoint. When he has become trained in this too, he should put aside the slate and learn to sing in improvising on a plain chant or on figured music from a book or a sheet of paper. But, as you can imagine, in this there is need for continual exercise. So I really like this passage. This is a little bit what I try to do in my own classes, to structure like this, that the students learn, I don't give them slates, that the students learn note against note counterpoint, and then they learn to improvise it. They learn, and I tend to use a series of visualization techniques and sort of models, let's say, in order to transfer this knowledge from one to the other. And then they learn to write florid counterpoint, starting with a stable cantus firmus, and then they learn to sing florid counterpoint, to improvise florid counterpoint. And so I really try as much as possible to have improvising and writing being the core elements of my counterpoint teaching. And it's based pretty much on this Coquelicot example. What I don't do with my students, I've tried it a little bit myself, is to try and improvise on menstrual music. So I have a friend, a colleague who I've sung with quite a lot. He's actually a keyboard player. And we get together, we do it online quite a lot, actually. And we go through books of Bicinia and we sing one part and then try and create on the spot a second voice, trying to, first of all, work out the implied contrapuntal motions, like the points of imitation, the cadence points, etc. And try and do it, we have our first attempt is maybe not amazing, and then we keep going, we build it up. And it, of course, becomes somehow an unwritten composition as we do it, as we get more and more clear ideas of what we'd like to do. And then afterwards, we compare it to the original. So that's kind of a fun exercise to take this a step further than just improvising on a cantus firmus.
Is this Fuchs species counterpoint in some way? Because he said writing note against note, and I of course I think now people, the mainstream view is that it's Fuchs is a neo-Palestrinian way of learning counterpoint,
yes,
but more for the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
But still, there's some idea of note against note and that sort of training and species. Is species itself quite old, and that whole idea of learning counterpoint?
So the notion of sort of a progressive way of teaching counterpoint, the first source I've come across which works like this is an early 15th century source by Antonius de Leno.
15. Okay, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
But it's not species in necessarily the way that Fuchs might understand it, but it's progressive in this sense that it starts off with whole notes and then basically increasingly complex ways of decorating these whole notes. And actually, we would find a lot of these examples pretty contrapuntally grim. Basically, it starts off with parallel octaves with a note with a third in between, or something like that, if I remember correctly. But this idea of building up a pedagogy through progressively complicated examples is not new in the 18th century. But of course, the style which Fuchs is trying to transmit is not his own. And the species method, exactly as Fuchs transmits it, is his own invention. But there are progressive ways of teaching counterpoint documented in the 16th century. I find personally that they can be useful, especially for my own practice. When I'm singing, I will quite often try and improvise in a sort of Fuchsian species method, partly because my own background in Fuchs is not as extensive as I would have liked it to be. I did Fuchs for a year at the end of my master's because I felt like I'd missed something not having done it. So while I was writing Fugue, etc., I was doing Fuchs at the same time. It was deeply frustrating. Uh, but it's certainly not this process of adding more increasingly complex exercises to a stable cantus firmus is not new. So starting off with note against note counterpoint is actually the basis of counterpoint. The term counterpoint famously comes from punctus contra punctum, like point against point.
Yeah. But isn't that what Cochleo is saying here? I mean, isn't he saying that you beginners ought to start with note against note and then, well, Fuchs didn't talk about improvisation, but this idea of building up progressively from into more florid things.
Cochleo is quite typical in this, in that he basically just divides into simple and florid counterpoint. So step 1 and step 2.
Oh, okay, 2 steps.
Right? I actually find increasingly logical, to be honest. I have taught Fuchs a little bit, and I draw a little bit of inspiration from Fuchs, as I said, in my own practice and my own teaching. But I find actually somehow, especially if the students, this is what I meant a little bit earlier when I mentioned about being immersed in the traditions, the melodic traditions of the genre. If the students are immersed in the traditions of the melodic traditions of the genre, then building up step by step isn't so necessary. So it's to do with the sort of total immersive experience, immersive education in Renaissance music, which for me, to a certain extent, removes or at least lessens the need to build up exactly step by step. So then, if the students are familiar with the style, going from note against note to florid counterpoint is not wild. It's not a wild step.
Yeah. Did you feel that your singing for all those years made you help you in learning how to compose? Because I think a lot of people go into music college at 18 really not knowing much other than playing repertoire. I mean, I think that's the very typical mainstream classical thing. But do you think singing all of this older music, and did it help you think like, the point is, compositionally, does it help you learn composition? Just all of that.
Well, from my perspective, and this is a little bit my my sort of central thesis, that Renaissance music in particular and earlier is singers' music. It's music for singers and by singers in a way that is a little bit unlike later music. The composers of this period were often singers, and increasingly in the 16th century, organists as well. But Josquin was employed as a singer. Obrecht was employed as a singer. Palestrina was a singer and an organist. You know, it really is singers' music for and by singers, and the theory is built around concepts which are relevant for singers. Let's say the pitch structure is dependent on solmisation in a way that later music, perhaps you could say, is dependent on keyboards, on the structure of the keyboard of the piano or the harpsichord, etc. Modal theory instead of tonal theory, and I know tonal theory is a little bit of an anachronism as well. But modal theory is essentially a way of classifying melody. It's not really well suited to thinking vertically, and the 16th century attempts to basically to jam melodic modal theory onto polyphony were, debatably not that successful. And so I think in my own practice, I think it has helped me really to better understand the makeup of Renaissance music, because it helps me to understand, at least I think it helps me to understand the way that melodies work a little bit, in a way which maybe I wouldn't have got if my first study had been that of a keyboard player.
Form is a huge thing that people obsess about. Form, when they're composing. So how did these 16th and 15th century composers think of their song composition, the structure of it? Obviously, there was a lot of liturgical to assist the liturgy, but what can you say about form for those composers?
It depends on what sort of genre we're talking about. Obviously, in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century, like the cantus firmus plays a very strong role in this. And with the cantus firmus, you have essentially your structure there. So you take a given melody and you manipulate it in certain ways, either through various different rhythmic machinations or whatever. And then you compose around this. You're adding something to a pre-existing melody, which is, of course, by the way, what you're doing when you're improvising super librum as well, improvising on a plain chant melody. However, later, when imitative counterpoint becomes more pervasive or more widespread, then you find questions a little bit more about what you're adding to. So Salino talks about adding to the first voice that's composed, and you are aware of the other entries as they occur. But broadly, imitative counterpoint, or if you take a mass by Palestrina or whatever, the form is often pretty simple. That it's imitation, free counterpoint, maybe repeating the points of imitation a little bit, then a cadence, and then either the theme is repeated with the same text, or new text starts. There's a new subject, some more new thematic material, a little bit of free counterpoint, and then a cadence. So it's pretty straightforward in that sense. And of course, as you said, the texts are based around what's needed for the liturgy often, especially, I mean, if we're talking about the Mass, for example, or they're taken from psalm texts or secular poems or whatever. So it's often from a vocal point of view. But broadly, that's, as far as I'm aware, as far as it goes in terms of form in the Renaissance.
I would love for someone to take a Renaissance musician and listen to all these arguments about form today. I would love for them to listen to it and see what they think about that. Okay, so Banchieri here.
Yeah, great. Okay, so this is one of my bugbears a little bit, but no, that's fine. We'll just carry on. So I love this passage. This is a passage by Banchieri, beginning of the 17th century. It's describing what seems to be a pretty wild approach to singing on the book, to improvised counterpoint. And I'll just read it out. So in Rome, at the Cappella di Notre Signore, isn't it? Whatever, in the Holy House of Loreto and in countless other chapels, while singing improvised allamente counterpoint above the bass, nobody does that which his partner sings, but everyone, with certain observations conferred among them, creates a very delightful sound. This is a general custom. Let 100 different voices sing, as it were, consonantly above the bass. Everything in accordance, and those few bad fifths and octaves, strangenesses and dissonances are all the graces which make the true effect of improvised allamente counterpoint. So this is a great passage. The idea that the dissonances are all the things that make the true effect of improvised counterpoint.
What is he describing? I mean, is this a daily occurrence in the?
If it's somehow it's almost a slightly conflicting passage, because I think it's describing somehow two different things. It starts off by talking about, well, first of all, the basic premise is that everybody is singing on the cantus firmus, sort of like we saw with that example from Marchand in the 18th century, the Gaudeamus. And he then goes on to describe that there are certain observations conferred among the singers. This suggests some sort of model. So I think if you go to the next slide, or maybe 2 slides on, or maybe three slides on, you'll see one more. That one. You'll see quite a typical model from this period, which is to have the upper voice moving in tenths. Yeah, there we are. With the lowest voice, and the middle voice moving essentially in contrary motion. So this perhaps seems to be the sort of thing he might be discussing when he talks about these observations conferred amongst them. But then he continues to say, first of all, that there are 100 people doing this. Now, presumably that is a little bit of an exaggeration, maybe not. But also that the dissonances and the strange fifths and the strange octaves are what make the grace and sweetness of improvised counterpoint. Now, this sort of model is very widespread in conversations about improvised counterpoint today. The idea that basically with a few tricks, you can quite simply create something that's contrapuntally convincing, although I would say that these are contrapuntally convincing-ish, and safe, in that they're specifically designed to avoid dissonances. So what I'm focusing on a little bit, and I'm not sure, maybe I shouldn't talk about it too much because I'm trying to prepare something for publication at the moment, is the idea that, as described by Polio, which you remember that hour ago or so, when he talks about all these people hearing what's going on and changing their pattern, changing their idea, changing their model. Yeah, this one, exactly. The idea that singers, my impression is that a lot of the time, singers were singing counterpoint above a cantus firmus, basically using all of the rules of counterpoint, but without much consideration for the other people doing the same thing at the same time, creating what sounds like a fairly cacophonous experience. Tinctoris, for example, says this explicitly, that when singers are improvising, when he uses the phrase cantare super librum, I think it's maybe even the first, certainly the first example of that phrase in a theoretical source. He says that all of the singers are only required to be concordant with the tenor, with the plain chant, and not necessarily concordant with each other. Where, as opposed to res factor, perhaps you could say composed polyphony, where of course the singers need to be concordant with all the other voice parts as well. So this is something I've been exploring quite a lot, this idea of essentially people doing free counterpoint at the same time on a cantus firmus. And I've included a little example from a live concert I did a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
It was in a festival for improvised music in Lausanne in Switzerland. And it was myself, this little example is myself, a friend of mine who's a keyboard player primarily, but is really a wonderful contrapuntalist, if you can say that. And another friend of mine singing the cantus firmus. So I've included the recording, but also a transcription of it, so we can talk about it a little bit as well. So this is the notation we sang from. It's from a serum gradual, the liturgy associated with England during this period. And it's an Alleluia. We sang it on the repeat of the Alleluia. And you can look at this, and basically looking at this, we generated the other voices on it. So this is what we saw, and then the modern score you just saw, that you just brought up on your screen, is what we sang from it.
Okay, so I'll just hit play and we'll see what happens.
Go for it.
Oh, again. This music is so good.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Where has this been all my life?
So there are a couple
Incredible.
of interesting things to talk about here. So first of all, you can see I've even highlighted them in red. We're both just looking at the plain chant, which appears here in the lowest voice. Yeah, exactly. We're both just looking at that manuscript. And our improvisations, and this was truly improvised in the festival, it's a live concert recording, hence the slightly weird moments every now and again. The improvisations are really just in relation to that. However, that's not quite true. As you can see, we imitate each other quite a lot. I took the lead on this one. Beforehand, we tended to say, okay, I'll start this one and you start the next one. So I tended to open phrases and then my colleague follows a little bit later. But basically, we're creating as elegant polyphonic lines above the cantus firmus as we could in the moment. And the result is, as Tinctorius says, sometimes we aren't consonant with each other. And it was quite a difficult experience to do this in real time. Of course, the majority of dissonances you find are between the fifth and the sixth, because above a cantus firmus, that's the only really option you have for dissonance. But of course, you find, as you heard in Banchieri described, the strange octaves and fifths. There are some very strange octaves and fifths here. I think I'd be very upset with my counterpoint.
Strange? What was strange about that?
Well,
Was
look
great.
at this. Is that bar 10 or are my eyes deceiving me? You see that G to A? That is a strange
Oh,
octave.
come on, strange.
Yeah.
And this, that was just mind transporting, soul transporting music. Fantastic. Strange. I mean, this is unbelievable. Very nice, very nice. I think it's really now. Okay, so you said earlier, and I want to just jump. I want to keep things a little wild here. So you said you sing quite a bit of 18th century music yourself. You sing some Bach, and you sing. So okay, are they distinct eras, epochs in music? Are they totally different? Are we in the world of tonal music, as Fétis would say? And is that a different? Is your Renaissance training not really useful for the 18th century, or do you find there are some echoes or even full relevance in a different era like the 18th century?
Sure. I think it's maybe important to separate two different concepts here. One is historically, what's going on in terms of the theory, the practice, and the composition. And one is what it means to be a singer today in the early music movement. So historically, there are obviously huge parallels. We looked at that Marchand example in the 18th century, and you could have almost taken it out of a not very good 16th century counterpoint textbook and plonked it onto some 18th century plain chant. Plain chant, of course, being the thread which connects all these things together, right? But as of course you know, you can talk about solmisation, 6-note, 7-note, 4-note solmisation throughout this period as well. And there are huge parallels in that sense. There are certain parallels in terms of compositional practice, of course, lots of differences as well. So there are lots of parallels that you can draw upon. Apart from anything, it's increasingly clear that a lot of 18th century musicians performed earlier music regularly. The famous example is Bach, who had this collection, what was it called? Florilegium Hortense or something like that, which is a collection of motets by Lassus and his contemporaries. So we know that
did,
Bach,
huh?
Yeah.
Oh,
Bach
okay.
would have performed, I think it's even on IMSLP if you want to grab it up for the viewers.
Let's pull it up.
Yeah. So we know that, for example, Bach was performing probably as actually the bread and butter of his job, performing 16th and early 17th century music. So I think it's difficult to talk about a direct break between modal and tonal theory. Modal theory was still and is still widely discussed during this period. I had a student just on Monday who was talking about he said something like, when did modal, and if you're watching this, sorry, he said something like, when did people stop using modes? But it's not really, sort of never. If you look at a modern plain chant book, you can organize everything according to modes, and indeed it is organized according to mode. In the 18th and 19th century, plain chant especially was still organized by mode. So here we are. This is the lovely collection, Florilegium Hortense, which Bach would have had and would have sung from, would have worked from. However, that's not really what you asked. Sorry, I got sidetracked ever so slightly.
Just the using Renaissance skill and all what you've just talked about for the last couple of hours. Like in 18th century, do you find that thread? Is that thread, those skills, a Renaissance musician's skills? Would he thrive in the 18th century? I mean, well, he'd have work in a church, of course, but but again, looking at 18th century Baroque and Galant music.
So looking at 18th century Baroque and Galant music, and looking at 18th century compared to 16th century descriptions of the expectations of a singer, for example, because let's talk about singers for the moment, there are clearly a lot of differences in terms of what seems to be vocal expectations, although, of course, gleaning sort of aesthetic ideals from the written word is difficult. But there certainly seem to be some differences between 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century sources on singing. The notation is very different. Of course, 16th century musician is used to 16th century notation, and 18th century notation, it's maybe it's different. Let's say less different than 15th century to 18th century, but there are differences there. Things like chants sur le livre were still widespread in France, but for example, I don't, as far as I know, don't think the Bach singers would have indulged in it very often, if at all. The approach to ornamentation in the 16th century, for example, ensemble ornamentation is widely documented in the 16th century with lots of people ornamenting at the same time, or in a polyphonic texture, let's say, but it's not documented quite so clearly in the 18th century, or at least not in the same way. So there are some clear distinctions there. However, perhaps since you mentioned sort of my own experience, this is a little bit of a different question, because it talks a little bit about what are the expectations of a singer in the early music movement. And realistically, most singers that you meet in the early music movement are freelancers. They have to be able to jump, even if they're specialists in early music, they have to be able to jump between Bach to Palestrina to Schütz to, I don't know, Pergolesi, etc. Perhaps even, jumping to Mozart, perhaps even going further, Beethoven, whatever. Unlikely to find a person who sings both Bach and Palestrina and Wagner, but hey, probably there are people out there, and I'm sorry if I've neglected you in saying that you don't exist. So the reality, I think, is that in the early music world, we need to, as singers, be pretty much able to do lots of different things. And unlike a violinist or, I don't know, whoever, we can't pick up a different instrument. We can't restring our violin with using different materials. We can't find a different lute. We can't get a lute in different tuning. We can't find a lute with a different number of courses, etc. We have to work with basically the same instrument that we use for speaking, that we use for, the same instrument I'm using now to talk with you. I'm going to talk with my friends in the pub in a few days' time. I'm going to sing in a concert of Bach. I'm going to sing in a concert of Palestrina, etc. So we have certain limitations physically, I think, in terms of how flexible we can be. And there are some very, very flexible singers out there, but we're expected, what I'm trying to say in an extremely roundabout way, is that we're expected to sing everything, basically, in a way that I think, in all sorts of different styles, in a way that singers from the past might not have been expected to in quite the same way.
What I wanted to know is if you look at, I don't know, the Mass in B minor by Bach, or it's just something that's from the 18th century, and would your sudden I just want to know, the Renaissance glasses come on, and you're seeing things that people might not see if you were not trained in Renaissance counterpoint and polyphony and plain chant and that. So that's what I'm asking is,
oh yeah, I see.
Do you have the special Renaissance glasses that, because I know this is true for all these harpsichordists. I give them 19th century music. I said this appoggiatura, that appoggiatura, and then they rip apart 19th century romantic music, just tear it apart, and just like, you're supposed to be a 17th century harpsichordist. What are you doing? Just thoroughly analyzing this romantic music. So in the same way, when you have these Renaissance goggles on, I mean, when you look at 18th century sacred music or whatever, do you see some things happening, some threads that sort of maintain in an odd way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, a good example is solmisation. We mentioned inganno techniques earlier. They can often be quite clear in later, especially Italianate schools of composition. You mentioned Bach's B minor Mass. That's a great example because so much of it is reminiscent of the Prima Pratica, right? Credo in unum Deum. It's of course a plain chant melody, right? But the way of setting it feels like it could almost be taken out of Palestrina with a few twists here and there. So I'm sure that I do view things in a certain way, as somebody who spends most of his life singing Renaissance music. And I'm sure that I do sort of superimpose some of these expectations and judgments onto later music. A nice example might be talking about modality and tonality, looking at how later composers might set earlier tunes, especially chorale melodies. There are some interesting comparisons to be made between earlier and later styles of thinking vertically, let's say, of organizing pitch content.
Wonderful. Okay, so what is this?
Yeah, this maybe it's not necessary to include it, but since I thought Banchieri mentioned 100 singers, and I did
Yeah.
say he was probably exaggerating, I just thought this might be a nice little example to suggest maybe he wasn't exaggerating too much. So this is a choir book which was used by Lassus at the court in Munich to perform Brunel's famous earthquake mass. And it's
Hmm.
you can sort of see it's pretty big already. You have all the voices, all that red pen down the left hand side, and then on the other page as well, the same. Those are sort of voice distributions. But then, if you look actually even closer, you can probably zoom in on the left hand
Yeah.
page. Those little scribbles in black ink on the very far left hand corner. Those are the names of performers.
Oh, wow.
So you have, how many is it for each part? I forget. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think if I remember correctly, there are between 35 and 40 singers. Names of
Richard.
that old chap. Yeah.
What's he doing there?
So this must have been a pretty immense performance, with all these performers singing or playing
Yeah.
this piece. And I also find it rather sad that the people singing Discantus, presumably choristers, didn't deserve to have their names included. Maybe because they were choristers and not old enough.
Right.
But I can't remember. You can go through and count it up if you'd like. How many singers there are here? But it's a few. It's enough to be quite an impressive sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one here. Pietro Cerrone.
Yeah, we've sort of covered this a little bit as well. It's what I was saying about the approach between models. In improvised Renaissance counterpoint, we like very much to talk about models. So I use the example of one voice moving in parallel tense and an inner voice moving in contrary motion. You also have models in which the bass alternates 5 and 3, for example, below the tenor. The upper voice moves in parallel 6. The middle voice, the altus, alternates 3 and 4, which basically creates chains of root position chords. You have things like faux bourdon, moving in first inversion chords parallel. You have all these different canons, which are essentially really model-based ways of creating counterpoint or harmony around or inspired from a plain chant melody. And this is great. These were clearly really widely practiced. There are lots of references to it in historical sources, perhaps one of the most famous being this wonderful manuscript treatise by Lusitano, which has been translated into French by, was it Canguilhem? I think it was. You could find it, maybe it's a wonderful book. It's Chants sur le livre, the treatises of Vicente Lusitano, if I remember correctly, something like that. And these are really all descriptions of models that can basically be, cut and stuck onto a plain chant melody. And without too much difficulty, you create something beautiful and reliable and safe. However, what I love about this passage by Cerrone is that he says basically what I think most counterpoint teachers might tell you anyway, that actually just singing in parallel tenths isn't really very good counterpoint. And so he says, finally, note that sometimes due to a lack of singers who know how to sing counterpoint, it is customary to sing counterpoint in 3 voices in the following way. So then he goes on to just say, the highest voice sings entirely in tenths. So this model we saw earlier. So I find this fascinating. And there are a couple of other sources which I found, which either hint or say explicitly, like Cerrone here does, at the same thing, that these models aren't the extent of the contrapuntal practice. In this instance, he says this is because of this model is used because we don't have enough people who actually know how to do counterpoint. And that's what I was trying to achieve a little bit with that recording of myself and my colleague we sang earlier, with the dissonances between the voices. We're not using a model at all. We are improvising, creating counterpoint on the spot, just looking at the tenor. And the result is, at times, a little bit cacophonous, especially because, yes, this example. Especially, there's one point where my colleague makes a lovely mistake, sings a B flat against an E natural. Fine. But when our voices collide in various different ways, mistakes happen. There's no fail-safe model to fall back on. But I find that really,
I didn't notice it.
well, I helpfully colored them in red so you can point out all the parallel octaves between us, the parallel fifths, the moment where I have a sixth and he sings a fifth, for example. But I find this passage by Tirone so interesting because it really hints at this more virtuosic approach to improvising counterpoint. And virtuosic is a really interesting idea for this because I'm thinking of a wonderful passage from Morley again at the end of the 16th century, who describes a sort of hypothetical competition in improvising counterpoint between his teacher, it's written in a dialogue format, so it's the teacher of one of these hypothetical students and another master in counterpoint. And he described that they were doing all the most, trying to do the most difficult things in improvising, who can repeat the theme the most, who can make a point, is the phrase they use. So who can repeat some thematic material the most or the most skillfully, who can do the most difficult proportions on the cantus firmus and that sort of thing. And I find this a really exciting, vibrant reference to this tradition, even if it was a little bit wild. And Morley himself is quite clear that he doesn't really believe that people can all improvise on a cantus firmus at the same time without sounding rubbish. But Banchieri, for him, this is the essence, he said, right? The dissonances, the strange parallels are the essence of improvising counterpoint.
Yeah.
So,
okay, go ahead. What is this? Orpheus?
This, going back a little bit, sorry, we've been going for quite a long time, haven't we? I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. This is great stuff.
This is from Ornithoparchus, this source we looked at with the 10-line stave, who talked about composers who aren't very good and therefore need to use, let's say, a score, this 10-line stave. And this is a really beautiful little engraving of what looks like a cartella. So it's essentially, we know that I showed you an example of the slate, which the students were writing on.
Yeah.
This looks like a wax tablet of some sort, which is perhaps more common, especially in the 16th century, that composers really became associated with their cartellas, their wax tablets, and used them in order to store ideas, to store examples, to write things out and to analyze them, perhaps in score format, but really to compose with. And so this is just a lovely little duo with Orpheus and Eurydice on either side, holding it up between the discant and the tenor. I just thought it was beautiful and a nice example of a cartella.
So, do you sing comfortably in different clefs? Are you comfortable in doing that? And is that a skill set that you've acquired or developed with this?
I sing far more comfortably in different clefs than I sing in different keys, which is probably not something I should admit to.
That's very interesting. Okay.
It's a very Baroque skill, right? If Baroque approaches to solmisation in different keys are to imagine different clefs, then I can absolutely relate to that. I'd much rather read something in, I don't know, I'd much rather read something in, what's a good example? I'd much rather read something in E major in the soprano clef and think of it in the soprano clef as a singer than read something and think about it in E major. I do, of course, do a little bit of both, but I do enough Renaissance music now that reading soprano clef is easier for me than reading treble clef in E major.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. And so, like, what about if you have to jump around then into like different clefs, like I don't know, alto and tenor and that sort of thing?
I mean, of course,
C clefs, yeah.
I would hesitate before saying I'm a perfect sight reader. Of course, like I find things difficult. Everyone finds things difficult, but I do find switching clefs, as I said, maybe easier at times than switching keys. Partly because I sing a lot of chant, a lot of Renaissance. A lot of chant is, of course, dependent on different clef changing. In Renaissance music, especially when teaching things, so when I work with my students, I quite quickly have to switch between soprano clef, alto clef, tenor clef, and bass clef, whatever. So switching between clefs I find increasingly easy, although I will add a big caveat to that. Because I do a lot of Renaissance music, mostly the point of switching clefs is to keep it on the stave, the notation on the stave. So when the music goes off the stave in a certain clef, I find it pretty quickly much more difficult because I never deal with it. A Renaissance composer, if they're writing the alto clef and they go up onto ledger, instead of going into ledger lines, they'll just use a soprano clef instead. So I would say that I relate to that a lot as well. But reading clefs, I don't find different clefs. I don't find too difficult. So there we are.
Okay, this quote by Corey.
Yeah,
I think I've seen this book actually on IMSLP.
Yeah, it's floating around there. It's an interesting one. So Corey was he supposedly studied with Porpora, this famous Italian castrato teacher. And
his son-in-law Dussek. So it's something I remember. His son-in-law is a great pianist, yeah. And then I think they all went, yeah. But he was he was trained by that whole lineage. So yeah, very very authoritative sort of person.
You could well be right about that. I don't know. I have to say, I know he moved to Scotland and published this really interesting book on singing. And I chose this passage to talk about a little bit because I think it represents the differences in expectations between a singer's training today and the singer's training historically. We said we'd talk a little bit about what it means to be an early music singer today. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it and we can just think about how heavy this sounds. So the intention of this exercise, and it's the messa di voce, singing a single note and swelling and decrescendoing, is to acquire the art of taking breath and how to retain it, by which is affected the swelling and dying of the voice, the most important qualification of the vocal art, and may be learned in a few days by moderate, regular, and frequent practice. Begin by half an hour at a time, singing single notes with a crescendo and decrescendo, increasing more and more in proportion to the age and strength of the constitution on an average, and more in proportion to the age and strength of the constitution on an average from 2 to 3 hours each day.
Wow.
Just singing long notes until it is acquired, after which you may relax the exertion, but you must never abandon it totally as long as you wish to improve and preserve your voice. So I chose this example because it's wild. I tried this during COVID, and I did about 2 days, and it was awful, really horrible, which probably meant it was really good for me. But
2 to 3 hours. Wow, that's a lot of singing.
Right, but just single notes. In fact, the next page, the next slide, is demonstrating what he means by this. So it's single notes on the vowel a here with a crescendo and a decrescendo. It's a beautiful little image. This is also lesson 1, by the way, which is pretty crazy. But just to sort of point out, this is an extreme example. I don't know any other sources which talk about going up to 3 hours singing messa di voce exercises. But just to point out that the expectations of what it means to be a singer today and what it means to teach are totally different. If you were to try and take a bunch of children and throw them into the conservatoire tradition that Bernie describes in his visit to Naples, for example, you're going to be called out for child abuse. I mean, it's really an absurdly different world and an absurdly different approach to pedagogy.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's true. I mean, there are a lot of emigres. I noticed that they traveled all around Europe. So it really was the case that those singers, the Italian singers, really traveled around. So now this is a 17th century source.
Yeah, it's just so again, we said we'd talk a little bit about what it means to be an early music singer. I was thinking a little bit about an event, a concert I once went to, typical sort of freelance event where I turn up for the soloist for a choir. We were singing some Buxtehude, and I had like a good little, it was, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, like a good little early music singer had written in all my ornaments. I don't do much late 17th century music, so I wanted to make sure I got it right. and I sang it through my few pieces, and the conductor, who I don't think knew anything about early music, about 17th century style at all, maybe he did, just sort of turned to me and, in a word, scrapped my hours of work and said something like, maybe without any ornaments. Um, and I think it's really difficult. It's a difficult thing when my students, who get really excited often about historically informed performance, and they're trying to apply it to their professional life, and their, even, dare I say it, some of their main subject singing lessons. Frankly, a lot of what we read about historical singing is just not applicable to the modern aesthetic of early music. And we can either fight it, which, I do fight it, and I have fought it. Maybe I'm a little
Let's
bit less,
go.
maybe I'm a little bit less radical as I get older, but still, there's a sort of inherently
Let's go to war.
yeah, there's like an anti-establishment vein in the early music movement, I think, and that's great. But this conductor, this older bloke who had much more experience than me, he said, "Don't do any ornaments," and I didn't do any ornaments. So it's a difficult situation to find yourself in, especially as a young singer. And so this passage, I think, is just wild, because I couldn't imagine this happening in a piece of late 17th century German music. So we'll just read it and we can move on if you'd like.
Yeah.
So,
Read it.
in such other florid ornaments which well-practiced singers use when singing solo, one has a lot of license and freedom, so that the organist only plays after hearing, and must usually adapt themselves with the keyboard according to the voice by following the singer's running throat, soon here and soon there, making diminutions and changes to the notes. So fine, that's not too crazy. However, it should properly be taken into account that if one of the singers is particularly determined to make florid ornaments in a complete, and I thought polyphonic, piece at a final cadence, the other singers should elongate their trills until they, the virtuoso, comes to a close, and give them every room and place to let their art be heard in a good piece. So if you have several singers singing at the same time in a choral movement, let's say, and one singer wants to do a particularly florid ornament, like a cadenza, let's say, the other singers, they should just trill until he's done. That's wild. I just so totally couldn't imagine that happening in this Buxtehude performance that I was working on, but really in anything from the sort of late 17th centuries that I've heard with singers.
So you saw the score and you were writing in your ornaments that you were planning to
Sure.
perform. So basically you were prepared, you were ready, you were writing in embellishments and diminutions and things to that's that's such a yeah, I like that. I mean, that shows a craft. It shows a living musician who's alive and trying to adapt yeah. Well, things are changing, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But for me,
Yeah.
actually, the craft and the tradition of things being alive, for me, it's more trying to learn these ornaments, trying to embody them, trying to make them part of my musical personality. So with Buxtehude, I don't know the style very well. I don't sing much Buxtehude, and so I really went to the sources and I copied out examples and I wrote things in. With Renaissance music, I mean, I don't have to do that quite as much. I can, not as well as some. Some people are very, very fluent in ornamentation. I'm not as fluent as others, as some. Um, but to a certain extent, I try and improvise it. I try and memorize patterns, and I try and regurgitate them at appropriate times.
Who's the best Renaissance singer alive today? Tell me.
What a terrible question.
Yeah. Or rather, just tell me a couple of good names that.
Well, tell you what, why don't I put you in the direction of a wonderful initiative which happened during COVID, called the Bovicelli competition.
Okay.
And the Bovicelli competition essentially was a competition in which singers from all over the world submitted their performances of a series of ornamented, I think they're all madrigals or some motets with secular texts attached to them from this treatise by Bovicelli in the 1590s. And they're wildly
Not
Bovicelli.
Botticelli.
If you want, you could just go onto YouTube now and look up Bovicelli competition winner, and I think you'll find some pretty amazing examples.
Okay. What is this? What is this page here you've pulled up?
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I just sort of threw a load of interesting things into this document. We don't actually have to talk about all of them if you don't want to.
I want to. Let's
You
go.
want to? Great. So this is a really interesting manuscript treatise on plain chant from Toledo at the beginning of the 16th century. If I remember correctly, it's dated somewhere between 1500 and 1550. As in, we don't know when it's from. It's a manuscript without a date on it. And this is fascinating because it mentions ornamentation in plain chant, which is not a totally radical suggestion, but it goes into surprising amounts of detail. But it's beautiful because it provides these graphic representations of the ornaments themselves. So if you want to zoom in on any one of these, I suppose. There we are. Yeah, you see the little signs?
Yeah.
So I've actually made a little translation of this as well, which is on my website, Cacophony. But I'll just talk you through a little bit through some of these ornaments. Basically here, this first one, we have description of breaking the note. So you have these two ways of breaking the note, three ways of breaking the note, sorry. We have this something like, and then, or, something like that. It's of course difficult to know. It's always a problem trying to translate historical writing into sound, but somehow the illustrations maybe suggest something a little bit clearer. Anyway, this is the onda. It's a wave. The next one, it's just a little touching the note above. Here. The next one, this one's a little harder. Tremolatio. It's some sort of trembling sound, maybe a vibrato of some sort. Maybe some sort of, if I remember correctly, the text talks about not touching the note above and below, but it's some sort of vibration, not entirely sure what. And then below you have the two waves, the dos, ondas. So I think these are just beautiful examples from a period we don't necessarily associate with this sort of ornamentation. These graphic representations of ornamented singing in plain chant. Really cool.
Okay, so this is a pretty recent article. Oh, recent, I mean the 20th century.
Yeah, sure.
By Peter Phillips.
Yeah. So this is quite a famous little passage. It's from an article entitled Performance Practice in 16th Century English Choral Music by Peter Phillips, who, as you may know, is the director of the Tallis Scholars. The Tallis Scholars...
No, but I know the Tallis Scholars, and they are, of course, one of the very famous sort of vocal groups for early music.
Yeah, so I think it's just a remarkable passage, and it's been picked up perhaps most famously by Taruskin, this very well-known critic of the early music movement in the 90s. And Peter Phillips basically says flat out, we can guess at the type of sound produced by 16th century choirs, and the evidence suggests that imitation of them would be highly undesirable. And that's great. You know, he fully lays his cards on the table, but I think it's something that maybe is worth just mulling over a little bit when we're talking about historical performance practice. And I'm sure I say mulling over a little bit, it's all we think about, it's all we talk about when talking about historical performance practice. But what if we wouldn't like it? And I think quite often, I frankly do think that we wouldn't like a lot of historical music making. What if we wouldn't like it?
Really?
I don't know. For example, there's a famous article by Richard Scher called something like Competence and Incompetence in the Sistine Chapel in the Age of Palestrina. And he just provides lists of singers with pretty damning descriptions next to their names. Things like, is a drunkard and can't sing. Actually, I think I know that guy. Yeah, and the Sistine Chapel, I think that's fascinating, the idea that... So even those institutions which aren't described in quite so derogatory terms, I think aesthetics are so flexible, and the human voice is so flexible that it's quite an assumption and quite difficult to say that we would necessarily like performance practice of the past. And I included two recordings.
Was he perhaps referring to this quote here, when you made that line, or was he?
Yeah,
no, I'm just saying. Anyway, sorry, you were talking about the recordings.
If totally say that some of the aesthetics of some of like our associations aesthetically with Renaissance polyphony might be things like purity and I don't know, neatness and all this sort of idea. Then, frankly, a lot of performance practice descriptions contradict that pretty much flat out, such as Banchieri saying, "Oh, but they sang fifths and octaves, and it was you know, a bit of a mess, but who cares?" We don't tend to listen to a performance of Palestrina and say, "Ah, but it was a bit of a mess. Who cares?" You know, we expect something which I don't think necessarily would have got. Even in notated music, descriptions of ornamented practice is pretty wild at times from
Mm.
this period.
Well, the
Um,
Tallis scholars, and I think Peter Schubert said in the last interview, I
mhm,
mean, the British sort of recording is a polished, like just CD quality to these
mm.
British ensembles, just perfection, right? In a lot of these recordings.
Yeah, polished is a really nice word, and I don't think that we would find such polish on historical performances. And I included two recordings which you might find interesting.
Yeah,
If we have time, I don't want to go
we
on.
have the time. Which one do we do? The 2,000 Years of Music or the
Why don't you
La
do
Cruda?
the Palestrina La Cruda? It's
Okay.
Yeah, and I've included a score in the collection of documents I sent you as well. So
Yeah.
this is a recording made by the Sistine Chapel Choir um, at the beginning of the 20th century. The series of recordings is most famous perhaps for the fact that they're mostly focused around the so-called last castrato, Alessandro Moreschi.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know if you've heard any of these recordings, but they're really fascinating. They're recorded in between 1902 and 1904 in two sessions. But this is a really, really beautiful. The more I listen to it, the more beautiful I find it. But a really striking performance of this piece by Palestrina, and it's sung by, as far as I'm aware, an anonymous tenor and bass, um, an alto castrato, most likely a castrato called Domenico Salvatori, and the famous Alessandro Moreschi, the so-called Angel of Rome, um,
Mm.
singing the highest part. Uh, and maybe it's worth just having a listen now, because I think that this really, they clearly are deeply invested in this way of singing. There's nothing fake or forced about it. Forced, maybe we could debate that, but nothing fake about it. Um, and yet to us, it's monstrous. I mean, certainly my students often laugh when I show them this recording, for example.
Mm.
Um, And so I think that recordings like this make us question a little bit our assumptions about how historical music should sound, not because this is how it necessarily sounded by any means, but because we can hear four people utterly convinced that what they're doing is the most beautiful way they can possibly perform this music, or in that moment
Mm.
in time at least. And it just sounds so different from what our expectations of this music should sound like.
Yeah, I wonder is because we're coming out of the 19th century,
Hmm.
and there's a that's kind of a and I wonder how close that is to the Renaissance, or perhaps is that an artifact of the 19th century with all that opera swirling around. And
But,
I wonder,
of course,
I
it's
want,
absolutely
I wonder, I wonder.
well. My opinion, it's absolutely an artifact of the 19th century. Um, we like to. I don't think any singer or any person is really out of their time. They are products of their environment in the same way that everyone is.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, it's maybe worth mentioning that the Sistine Chapel made a bit of a thing about the fact that they were the only institution to have a direct line from
Mm,
Palestrina to the present day. Especially in the 19th century, this is a big deal with the
okay.
Cecilianist movement, etc. So
Yeah.
maybe not still at this point, although maybe I'm wrong. Certainly, there is this bit of rhetoric floating around that they represent the real way of performing Renaissance music. And in fact, certainly the Northern Europeans who went to explore the Sistine Chapel at the beginning of the 19th century, like Spohr and Mendelssohn, were often quite disappointed by what they heard. Um,
Really? Okay. Yeah. Tell me about that. So,
yeah, well,
okay.
I mean, it's not really my area in particular. I couldn't tell you too much detail. Um, but there are some pretty, let's just say there are some very wild descriptions of the performance practice of the Sistine Chapel Choir from the beginning of the 19th century, sorry.
Mm,
Um, but I think they're absolutely a product of their time. My point is not to say that these guys
mm,
are really reflecting Renaissance performance practice, but that, for me at least, performing this music in this way is totally unthinkable. And yet here we have it, evidence that these people living in this tradition, probably in a way that I would never live in this tradition. I mean, they were
mm,
singing this music in Rome, in the Sistine Chapel,
yeah.
for their whole lives. That these people living in this tradition, this is the way to perform it. And so
Yeah.
just 100 years ago, or 120 years ago or so, this is radically different. And you don't actually have to go that far back in recording history to find recordings which are still pretty different. Um, I was
Yeah.
listening to a recording even from the 60s the other day, and it just feels old enough to be very surprising at times. And I think go back a couple more 100 years, you're going to find more differences than I think perhaps we might feel comfortable with. Just that
That no,
my
you are so yeah, you're so insightful on this because yeah, you know, now that I think about it, I remember reading the Vladimir Horowitz biography, and he was almost heralded as this first CD quality type concert pianist, and like everyone else was making mistakes here and there, and I remember it's like, oh, he would come off the stage and, oh, I made one mistake, and another pianist would be like, one. And I'm just thinking, yeah, you know, we're so used to no mistakes and no
Mhm.
mistakes, you know,
Yeah,
and that it's a culture now. You make one mistake, and you know you're terrible, you're a fraud, you're a fake, and all of this.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, let's pull up that quote again by Phillips here, which is like, would we like it? You know that would be highly undesirable. Well, did somebody criticize him for that? Was it like a flashpoint sort of?
Um,
What was the
criticizing
response to that line?
the the example I'm thinking of is Richard Taruskin, who pulls
Oh,
it up.
right.
And it's been a while. If I remember correctly,
Yeah.
he cites it as some sort of hypocrisy within the early music movement, and maybe it is. I mean, Taruskin is talking in the '90s, which frankly is a time I was born in '92, so the early music
Mm,
movement in the '90s is not something I'm particularly I can say I experienced. Let's say, but from what I understand, from my listening to recordings, talking to my colleagues, reading program notes from that period, reading to Ruskin and other criticisms.
yeah.
There was a lot of conversation about authenticity, um, about trying to recreate the sounds of the past, and
Mm,
for various different reasons, Ruskin talks about why this is impossible, undesirable, philosophically a bit vague. But if I remember correctly, this is one of the passages he cites from really quite a famous group specializing in early music
yeah.
to sort of defend his point.
Can't you have both? I mean, like, you know, in philosophy, you have like moderated realism where you have two extremes and then you come to the perfect scholastic middle. Isn't there a sense where you can have like, you really strive for Tallis scholar type sort of fidelity of perfection and polish? And then you also have a sort of informed approach that you try to have that happy middle.
I think you probably can. And in a way, I think that's sort of what I do with Cappella Pratensis, um,
Yeah.
because we don't explore all of the wild performance practice descriptions of the period. We do some of them, um, and we try and implement some things which maybe create a certain degree more cacophony than we might be comfortable with. Um, yeah, here I am. Look at that. But broadly, we're a professional vocal ensemble who treads quite a difficult, who tries to get quite a difficult balance between what it means to be historically informed, um, while also inhabiting the world of professional music making. I mean, we're all
Mm,
professional singers in the group. We all make either most or all of our money from music making. We all work with other groups, and we're all expected to. Many of us have been through the conservatoire system, and so how do we then, as singers, deal with these pretty wild, things that might not get us hired in the future, putting it bluntly.
mm,
Um, so my part of my approach, and it's difficult to put it all on paper, I suppose, but part of my approach is trying to um, embody the musical traditions that we engage with. So it's why I've tried to focus so heavily on a single musical culture. Um, so for me, that means reading from the historical notation, engaging directly as much as possible with the notation, the theoretical sort of underpinnings of the music making, um, engaging with historical solmisation and the Guidonian hand, the sort of backdrop, the theoretical background to a singer's and a musician's life. Using working with historical pronunciations, working with historical improvisation and historical composition, etc. It's all an effort to try and not have a superficial relationship with the music. For me, that's historical performance or not, almost to one side. What I want to avoid as much as possible is to have a superficial relationship with a style of music. And I think it's very easy in a world where we sing everything from, I don't know, a typical week in the English cathedral I sang in Truro might include Parry and Bird in the same service, pretty regularly actually. And I love that. I love that tradition, but I also find it strange. And this effort to dive into all of the theoretical contexts of it, that's what I try and that's what I'm trying to encourage with my own practice and with the practice of cappella. And then, in a way, the question of what happens, the specifics of performance practice, of course, we talk about it a lot. Things like, especially conversations about ficta, conversations about ornamentation, conversations about vocal production. We talk about it all the time, but in a way, somehow, for me, they feel secondary to the embodying the understanding, the approach to the music, and trying to, then working from there. And so the results we get, I'm sure they're not what a 16th century or 15th century choir sounded like. Partly because it's difficult to identify a single thing as what they sounded like. There was so much diversity then as there is now. But still, it's trying to find this way to engage with the sources intelligently in an embodied sense. That's what I'm really trying to work towards here. And we don't achieve the same level of perfection as the Tallis scholars, and I don't think we want to either. We've heard a few of the recordings, and there's some pretty open-throated stuff going on there as well. But we also don't sound like, the Sistine Chapel, the Moreschi and his singers from the Sistine Chapel. We try and find this balance, as you said, between professional music making and the historically informed and research, let's say. And I think in a way that's sort of what the historically informed performance movement has always done, has always tried to find a balance between what it means to make music for audiences today and what it means to engage thoughtfully with performance practices of the past and performance cultures of the past.
Absolutely, you do what you did for that. Was it the Machot, that canon, that fugue?
The Mouton, yeah.
The Mouton.
Yeah, exactly.
Incredible, perfect. Okay, it's been fantastic, hasn't it, Tim? It's been a great. I've had a lot of fun.
Myself this much, I promise.
This is a lot of fun for me because this is such a fun job for me. Not really a job. I mean, it's just a fun kind of hobby to do. So I think people will get a lot out of this. Now, this was a mutation game that you shared, and I think people should really check it out more. Can you explain it? And goodness, mutation really is a head scratcher for a lot of people. So maybe would this help in some way?
I hope so. We hope so. So this is part of an ongoing educational initiative on behalf of Cappella Pratensis, and we're currently applying for all sorts of subsidies to try and make it a reality. But basically, this is a little card game we invented to teach mutation. Do you want to watch the video first, or?
Yeah, let's watch it, and then you can give the DVD commentary.
I apologize for the bad jokes. It's a live video of us playing a game as we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Granny shuffle. Let's make granny noise.
Granny Shuffle feels like she should be a cartoon character or something.
Totally.
Granny Shuffle, the old.
That's you, Tim, right?
Dancer. Yeah, it's me talking.
she only shuffles anymore.
Exactly. And it's the other high countertenor of the group, Andrew Hallett.
All right. Ready?
You go first because you won.
Yeah.
We invented the game.
Good rule. Nice.
Right.
Well done. Okay. I turn over the first card, and it's a four of diamonds.
As far in the hard hexachord, I can immediately right off the bat ut in the natural hexachord and sol in the soft hexachord.
Oh my
Look
goodness.
at that.
Both mutations. Well, I know I can't mutate, but I can continue in the soft hexachord to la.
Yeah.
And take a card.
In the soft hexachord.
Yeah, great. So that's la in the soft hexachord. I cannot mutate, but I can just carry on here with my B flat. That's fa in the soft hexachord. And I picked up a card.
Okay. I can't mutate, but I can continue in the soft hexachord with re, G, and I'll take a card.
Good. I can mutate.
Yeah, I jumped octave in my left hand there, now G here rather than G here. But
in the hard hexachord. So this is G, sol, re, ut.
Why,
have
thank
Ray and
you
Ut.
very much, because I can mutate to
Your
sol
sol, yeah,
in
great.
the natural hexachord.
You should have looked ahead and seen that I can now do that and win.
Oh no!
Because I think if you put down, if you had thought, hey, I can mutate, but I'm going to take the risk here, I can do something else,
I could block you.
you can block me here, right?
Yeah,
And then I wouldn't be able to go, I'd have to pick up a card.
Yeah. I would have to be thinking ahead for that.
Yeah, but that was good.
Okay, good game.
Good game.
Well done.
Don't buy
That's
another.
fun. That's really fun. So like that's a game you can play with. So let me guess. You take out 7, 8, 9, right?
Basically, yeah. Everything except for
And keep 1 to 6. Okay, so what is red? Is there red and black? Is that, or how do you talk about the hexachords now?
So there's a complete set of rules on the YouTube video, so you can go and follow it there. But basically, see if I can remember, black is the natural hexachord. I think diamonds is the hard hexachord, and hearts is the soft hexachord. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. So clubs, I see. So yeah, clubs are the natural hexachord, hearts are the soft hexachord, and diamonds are the hard hexachord. And we have ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And essentially, you can mutate on them. So, for example, we started at the beginning with C, sol, re, ut here. Sol, re, ut. Sorry, sol, fa, ut. Whoops. It means it's sol in the soft hexachord, fa in the hard hexachord, and ut in the natural hexachord. And that means that I can put down, if you put down the 4 of diamonds, that's fa, yeah, right? Fa in the hard hexachord. I can mutate. I can put down sol in the soft hexachord, that's hearts, or ut in the natural hexachord, that's the ace, ace of clubs. And then I don't have to pick up a card. So the aim is to get rid of all your cards. And if you mutate, then you get rid of a card and you don't pick up. You can also simply go. You can continue in the same hexachord. So I think it started with what was it? Fa in the hard hexachord, so that's 4 of diamonds. So I can then continue in the hard hexachord. I could put down 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 of diamonds in order to continue, but I have to then pick up a card. So by mutating, you get rid of your cards, and the first person to get rid of all their cards wins.
That is awesome. That's a cool game. You came up with that, both of you guys?
It was fun.
That's really fun.
It was Andrew's idea originally. He wanted to invent a card game, sorry. He wanted to invent a game to teach mutation, which was made of dominoes. And I can't remember. It was just mind-numbingly complicated. So he's very good at lateral thinking, and I'm a little bit less good at that. So I somehow had to dumb it down for myself, and we came up with this instead. I think that we might consider a dominoes game about counterpoint, something with parallel motion and contrary motion, but that's in the future.
Yeah. Oh wow! So let's end this off. I have a question for you. So,
Go for it.
So if you have kids or young children, right? Like really young, 7, 8, 9, what would you start them if if you could go back to your own childhood, like if you could re-engineer your own training to optimize it or whatever, what would you do with the ages 7, 8, 9 in terms of singing?
Well, we've done a lot of
Contrapunto alla mente.
Yeah, we've done a lot of workshops with Cappella Pratensis, singing with kids from a young age. And a good thing to start with, I have always found, is canons. So I think it's important, first of all, I think it's interesting. It's a really good question. In our workshops, we do a lot with canons, and we often make canons out of well-known songs. And I think this is something which, for example, the Kodai system does very well. But also any tradition which is based on a shared repertoire of hymns or a shared repertoire of chant melodies does really well. If the kids already know a whole load of songs, use them, right? So the Kodai method is based on the idea that the kids knew a bunch of folk songs already, right? And traditions like hexachordal solmisation, it works really well if they already have heard some of these chants. I grew up singing Anglican hymns, and to a certain extent, that shaped the way I learned how to read and sing music. So we do a lot of canons. I showed you that Frère Jacques we did.
Yeah.
And actually, we did it simply as a canon. It works nicely just as a canon by itself in a series of workshops. And then we took this basic melody, through singing it as a canon, they create something that's interesting and beautiful, but also easy. And then we developed from there. So I made that polyphonic setting of Pater Jacobus.
Yep. Pater Jacob.
Because in Dutch it's Vader Jacob. And so that's, I think, a very good way in. I also find that the Guidonian hand is great. People love it because it's so tactile. It's so easy to pick up, and it provides you with a real sense of immediate feedback. What is harder, of course, is mutation. So practice is really, unfortunately, the answer when it comes to mutation. But I don't find any difficulty in getting kids interested in the Guidonian hand and singing, especially well-known melodies, especially in canons, that sort of thing. They tend to find it pretty enjoyable straight away. But obviously, the further you go down that road, the more difficult it gets and the more commitment it gets. It does take practice and time and effort, which obviously not all kids have. It takes a support system, parents who are willing to take them to the rehearsals and stuff. We're currently setting up a partnership, Cappella Pratensis, with a local children's choir attached to the cathedral in Den Bosch, which is our hometown. And we're really excited about it. It's going to be, I hope, great, but it really relies on the dedication of the parents to take kids to rehearsals, to pick them up, to wait around, to do all these sorts of things. So there are lots of difficult questions.
Okay, so concluding thoughts. I'm going to leave it to you with concluding thoughts.
Oh, goodness. I've been speaking all evening. I'm not sure I have any more thoughts left.
We wrap it up in a way that, kind of sums it all up, and I think in a profound way, Tim.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Profound wisdom on the spot. Goodness. Profound wisdom. I think that historical pedagogy is a really fascinating field. I think that there's a lot we can learn from musicians of the past. I think that there are a lot of very interesting overlaps between historical music pedagogy and modern music pedagogy. Ideas of improvisation are just as relevant in modern music pedagogy as they are when looking at historical music pedagogy. And I don't think that's a coincidence, by the way. I think we like to choose the bits from historical pedagogy which fit with our modern ideas of what we like historical pedagogy to be. I'm afraid that's all I've got for you. I'm all dried up.
No, short and sweet. I like it very much. So the great Tim Braithwaite, please check out his ensemble. Really, what a pleasure it's been. It's been very easy to talk to you, and it's been a lot of fun. And I hope you had a good time as well, Tim. So keep doing what you're doing, and keep sharing your information. And maybe we can have that panel as well on historical improvisation later. We'll line that up. That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it'd be great to really dive into some of the sources a little bit in more detail and to argue our perspectives a little bit. But likewise, please keep up the good work. I love watching your show, and very happy to have been part of it.
Well, the great Tim Braithwaite, thank you so much, sir. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.